Narcissists rewrite history to escape accountability. If serving is below you, leadership is beyond you. Good morning and welcome to the final day of the Appropriation Bill or Budget debate for 2022-23 for $1.8 billion, presented by the Minister of Finance, Philip J. Pierre, on Tuesday evening, April 26, when the House was suspended last night. We had heard from a number of speakers, but for now, the Speaker of the House is in the chamber and will go over to him.
Let us pray. Almighty God, by whom alone kings reign and princes decree justice, and from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom, and understanding. We, thine unworthy servants, here gathered together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that we, having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace and tranquility of St. Lucia, and the uniting and knitting together the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us evermore. Members, I just ask you to remain standing for a moment of silence for the ceasefire and hearing that the prophet is as we gather ahead his funeral. Thank you, Daniel. Good morning again, members, and thank you for being here. And as I stated just a little while ago, the funeral of former Parliamentary Rep for Castries South, Desmond Bradford, is ongoing, and I have a note from the leader of the opposition who is present at that funeral, and he has advised he'll be joining after the service is over. And I omitted yesterday to advise that I had received a note from the member for Castries Central who had indicated his inability to be with us yesterday. So I wish to state that for the record. Any ministerial statements? Members, when the House rose, the question before it was that the Appropriation 2022-2023 bill be read a second time. Member for Ancillary Canaries.
Runs on the board. John.
Yeah, you need to do that. Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by extending my condolences to the family of Andrew Jagannath of Ancillary, affectionately known as Culture, on his untimely death yesterday. Closer to home, I would like to also extend condolences to the family of Dennis Albert, also passed away earlier this week. On a lighter note, Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate the Canaries team on reaching the football finals this weekend. Having defeated the formidable Beaufort South, the member for Dennery, Mr. Speaker, Dennery South, is insisting that on Sunday he will deal with me. But I've taken the responsibility from the member for Grosley to deal with him for that unfortunate defeat on the weekend. Not this time around. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. I stand before this honorable House with the privilege to debate and represent. I wish to first take this opportunity to thank the Almighty God and the people of Ancillary Canaries for the honor to stand here today. I am especially grateful to my constituents for the trust, confidence, and prayers. Mr. Speaker, a few weeks ago, in this honorable House, we debated the estimates of revenue and expenditure for the financial year 2022-2023. Mr. Speaker, our government's policy statement and rationale for focusing this budget on empowering our people, transforming our economy, is foundational. Mr. Speaker, the plan of expenditure presented by this government lays the groundwork for St. Lucia's recovery. Mr. Speaker, 2 days ago, the Honorable Prime Minister presented the largest budget in our history, a budget that defines the roadmap for St. Lucia, a budget that characterizes our value system, inspires trust, hope, and confidence in our people, our communities, and our partners. Mr. Speaker, although, to use the sporting analogy because everyone used it yesterday, although we are in the early innings phase, I am encouraged that we will achieve our objectives. Mr. Speaker, the global environment continues to be turbulent, but despite this, we remain steadfast in our ideals and commitment to empowering our people and transforming our economy. Mr. Speaker, this budget represents this government's plan for St. Lucia's rebirth. Mr. Speaker, in this budget, 7 major challenges have been identified, but I wish to focus on 3 of them specifically. 1, achieving sustainable high levels of economic growth that support economic transformation and poverty reduction. 2, securing fiscal and debt sustainability. And 3, building resilience and adaptation to climate change. Mr. Speaker, how are we going to achieve high levels of economic growth to support economic transformation and poverty reduction? Mr. Speaker, we must first focus on the fundamentals and getting it correct. Mr. Speaker, you could practice your jump shot 8 hours a day, but if your technique is wrong, then you become very good at shooting the wrong way. I too am a sports enthusiast, and at times I recall the quote from Michael Jordan, "Get the fundamentals down, and the level of everything you do will rise." Similarly, the saying that rising tide lifts all boats is associated with the idea that an improved economy will benefit all participants, and that economic policy, particularly government economic policy, while focusing on broad economic outcomes, must consider all players. Mr. Speaker, in this budget, we have identified some deliberate policies, some new and others that are ongoing to support and promote this new era of our development. Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to making us proud to be St. Lucian, a pride that is demonstrated in our way of life as the people of this beautiful land. Mr. Speaker, creating a defined space for the youth as economic actors is fundamental for our sustainable development. Young people have a proven capability to lead change that is a vital and valuable investment for now and the future. Mr. Speaker, having targeted policies to promote youth as assets is a priority of this government. Mr. Speaker, our plan to invest and empower in our youth to realize their potential for training, mentorship, business advisory support, and the provision of financing is at the core of our transformation strategy. Mr. Speaker, we are advocating for the orange economy as another one of the strategies that is identified in the budget. Mr. Speaker, our small size compels us to focus on building a more resilient and competitive economy. By embracing the orange economy, specifically innovation, as a tool to ignite and change the current status quo that we have grown so accustomed to, we recognize there is a need to rethink our approach, our systems, our lax corporate culture, business models, and ecosystem that defines us. We can see the goalposts, yet to get through, we must agree on the game plan. Defining our strategy for this transformation journey is critical at this juncture. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, as a government, we have the responsibility to demonstrate and champion these efforts as we seek to reposition our economy on the growth path. Mr. Speaker, there is a clearly defined role for the government in innovation, creating the enabling environment that will foster an innovative and resilient business sector. The administrative structures of government need to be reformed to be as agile and responsive to the demands of the private sector. Mr. Speaker, we have the ongoing digitization project, which we expect to see the rollout of more digital government services. Mr. Speaker, I just want to highlight that our small size is a plus. Being small allows us to be nimble and flexible. Mr. Speaker, looking beyond the pandemic requires us to think outside the box. Mr. Speaker, we transitioned quickly to alternative work arrangements in the last 2 years because of the pandemic. But now that we are returning to an adjusted in-person world, how ready are we for this? Mr. Speaker, what are the lessons learned from the pandemic that we can leverage to encourage productivity and competitiveness in the public and private sectors? Mr. Speaker, I will leave the lessons of the pandemic for another session in this Honorable House, as I want to focus my attention on some initiatives under my direct responsibility as Minister in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Development, and the Youth Economy. Mr. Speaker, We have engaged in discussions with our development partners and have secured financial and technical support for some major initiatives, new and ongoing. The Millennium Highway West Coast Road, a Hall of Justice, the Grosley Police Station, St. Jude's Hospital, the Blue Economy, renewable energy, street lighting, just to name a few. Mr. Speaker, over the years, we have suffered from low implementation of our capital programs for many reasons. The low implementation is a concern for this Honorable House and every solution. Mr. Speaker, this concern becomes even more apparent when we come to this Honorable House to request authorization to borrow, whether on the RGSM, from our international financial partners, the Caribbean Development Bank, the World Bank, the Export-Import Bank, or the Kuwait Fund. Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious matter. The Honorable Prime Minister indicated that our public debt now stands at $4.13 billion, 90.6% of our GDP. Inherited, might you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government strategy has been to lengthen the maturity profile, reducing the cost of borrowing and rollover risk over the medium term. However, Mr. Speaker, we need to improve the rate of implementation of the capital program to further reduce any potential risk and cost. Mr. Speaker, when a capital project is developed, it means that it has gone through the necessary interrogation to identify potential risk so that corrective measures are built in. Mr. Speaker, this process should also involve a financial analysis. Mr. Speaker, we have a comprehensive national infrastructure financing strategy and country financing roadmap. We are currently reviewing the medium-term development strategy. Mr. Speaker, these are the fundamentals I spoke of earlier, getting it right, setting the baseline against which we will measure our progress. Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to defining a public sector investment program with the primary objective of achieving sustainable high levels of economic growth that support economic transformation and poverty reduction. Mr. Speaker, to achieve this, we have to do away with some of the norms of the past, some of the actions that have led us to where we are today, the unsustainable debt levels. And yesterday, my colleague mentioned briefly in his remarks the Gini coefficient. Mr. Speaker, the Gini coefficient is really a measure of the concentration of wealth in a country. The last time that exercise was conducted was when the Labour Party was in office. It was done recently, and it proves clearly that when the Labour Party is in government, the country is far more equitable than when the United Workers' Party is in government. Mr. Speaker, no longer will we be seeing DFCs that have not gone through the necessary interrogation. Mr. Speaker, when I drive around, it is hurtful to see some of the roads that we continue to pay quarterly are in a deplorable state. Mr. Speaker, the reform efforts mentioned by the Honorable Prime Minister are necessary if we are to achieve any breathing space in our fiscal position, to be able to reverse this shaky trajectory which we have inherited. Mr. Speaker, we know the historic challenges that the private sector has faced with financing. They cite the lack of credit as the main limitation to improving their businesses. At the same time, the financial system states that their lack of financial statements precludes them from getting access to credit. Mr. Speaker, we understand the plight of both sectors. The financial sector is changing rapidly before our eyes. Our compliance obligations with the international standards have caused us to amend legislation and increase some burden on our citizens who for various reasons interface with the banking sector. Mr. Speaker, this is a continuum. We will continue to respond to the demands as best as we can. However, we must recognize the needs of the private sector and how the new standards impact on their operations. Mr. Speaker, I have some concerns about the level of financial literacy and our readiness to embrace new instruments. However, Mr. Speaker, when I think of the benefits to be gained from the initiatives such as the ECPCGC, which, Mr. Speaker, is the Eastern Caribbean Partial Guarantee Corporation. I'm very encouraged for our private sector. Mr. Speaker, the recent discussions with our partners on the guarantee scheme have been very encouraging. The pandemic has been a true test for the ECPCGC. The number of requests for guarantees is growing. We see this initiative as support to entrepreneurs who are desirous of reviving their businesses, which will ultimately lead to retaining of existing jobs, creating new ones, and support the economic recovery efforts. Mr. Speaker, it is no longer business as usual. When we consider how we've been financing our development over the last 20 years and the vision this government has for St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, we need a sovereign wealth fund. Mr. Speaker, many countries have a sovereign wealth fund, and there is evidence of how these funds have contributed to meaningful ways to their development. Mr. Speaker, our efforts during this financial year will be focused on the fundamentals: what, how, where. Mr. Speaker, I read an article earlier that has me a little puzzled. And the article was quoting the Honourable Member for Miku South, the Leader of the Opposition. But I want to assure the members of this Honourable House that this government is not in the business of making false promises. We will take one step at a time and not skip any of the essential stages as we move towards the establishment of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Mr. Speaker, the role of the public sector in driving growth and how governments contribute to creating the environment that fosters growth at all levels of the economy is what the Honourable Member should be focusing on, rather than spewing untruths to disrupt the important activity that the people of this country has entrusted us with. Mr. Speaker, the role of the St. Lucia Development Bank in our development is being redefined. The capitalization of the bank is necessary. The demand on the bank is growing, especially in the post-pandemic era. And given the mandate to facilitate development by providing low-cost financing to the business sector, the bank must be adequately resourced to respond. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, the St. Lucia Development Bank has started the accreditation process with the Green Climate Fund. It is our hope that the bank achieves this accreditation during this financial year, so that St. Lucia will have its first direct access entity with the Green Climate Fund. Mr. Speaker, SLDB is currently involved in multiple initiatives financed by the GCF, which supports St. Lucia's climate action and agenda. Very much support to the Minister of Sustainable Development. These initiatives are being implemented through the CDB, the 5 Cs in Belize, and the GGGI, the Global Green Growth Institute. As a direct access entity with the Green Climate Fund, the SLDB will be able to access financing from the GCF to implement crucial climate change adaptation and mitigation interventions. The GCF works through a wide range of accredited entities to channel its resources to projects and programs that address the climate action. They can be private, public, non-governmental, subnational, national, regional, or international bodies. And the SLDB was selected to be the first national direct access entity. Mr. Speaker, next week, my ministry will be hosting a series of activities related to the Green Climate Fund. So more on this will be presented. Mr. Speaker, the government has established a strong national climate change framework, including a 10-year national adaptation plan process, priority sectoral adaptation strategies and action plans, and a nationally determined contribution process. Mr. Speaker, St. Lucia has also implemented of its first National Readiness Grant, which sought to strengthen its critical infrastructure and ensure the efficient, effective, and transparent use of climate finance, leading to concrete adaptation and mitigation interventions that can be transformative and impactful and is currently implementing its second. Mr. Speaker, while we have recognized climate change as the major threat to our survival, we have been implementing some response measures. The major infrastructure initiatives mentioned in the budget all consider climate change vulnerability in their designs, which to some extent has increased the construction cost. Mr. Speaker, as part of our donor engagement, we are considering, and it's a conversation that we're having within the ministry, whether or not we have a dedicated finance team to deal with climate finance. Mr. Speaker, that team will be dedicated to coordinating and accessing climate finance in keeping with St. Lucia's overarching climate action agenda. Mr. Speaker, I spoke to the orange economy earlier. Now I'll spend a few minutes on the blue economy. St. Lucia is indeed a large ocean state. What does that mean for us? The opportunities for development in the blue economy are huge. Through the new project that is funded by the World Bank, coastal infrastructure development will be prioritized. Mr. Speaker, I'm very interested in this project for many reasons, but more so for my constituents. Any improvement to the coastline of Answer and Canaries means improved quality of life for my constituents. Mr. Speaker, the other aspect I am interested in is the wastewater value chain. I'm told that this is the biggest secret in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, I will quickly bring in the Cashews Vision 2030. We cannot speak to developing cashews without addressing the elephant in the room. Not the one that re-emerged, who left yesterday and has now re-emerged, but the true elephant in the room. The solid waste and wastewater management issues in the city. Mr. Speaker, we want to see cashews being alive and inviting, so we must address the LBS protocol. Some members will be familiar with this term, which I am recently becoming familiar with. Mr. Speaker, cashews is our capital. It cannot be acceptable that when it rains, our citizens, whether they reside in Cashews or commuting to the bus stop, have to remove their shoes to commute to get to the bus stop. We must deal with those issues. Mr. Speaker, we can no longer delay action on this very important matter. Greening our economy, or aspects of our economy, is a policy that was agreed to when we agreed to the National Energy Transition Strategy, as well as other national interventions, like the CAF, the promotion of LED certification, etc. Mr. Speaker, you will recall the school children going around, reduce, reuse, recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle. We agreed to reduce the amount of energy resources that will be produced through fossil fuels. We agreed to explore our geothermal resources. We agreed to transition to more energy-efficient appliances. To support this policy, government has secured support from the various sources to demonstrate the use of the technology and the benefits. Mr. Speaker, what we failed to do was to address for our national procurement policy. I ask, was it the timing of the policy or was it incomplete? Mr. Speaker, I raise this as a concern because more and more our development partners speak to the 2030 agenda, and I am concerned on where we are in meeting our SDGs. Mr. Speaker, I use this as an example as it is cross-sectorial. Like this, there are many other policy pronouncements that remain incomplete and have not been assessed to determine why they have not met their objectives. Mr. Speaker, this one, for instance, has a long gestation period because it's about changing citizens' behavior. Mr. Speaker, we have a plan of action to execute, and we need to ensure that our engine is well oiled to produce the results. In addition to modernizing the delivery of public services through the modernization and capacity development, there is need for some institutional reviews. Mr. Speaker, over time, some departments' roles and functions have been modified without the necessary institutional review to guide its forward thinking or new configuration. Mr. Speaker, the time has come for us to reflect on where we are, who we are, what we are doing, and why we are doing it. Mr. Speaker, I am proposing to start with my ministry during this financial year, so that as a team, we could deliver the outcomes pronounced in the budget efficiently. Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss of me not to take a few minutes to discuss St. Jude's. Yesterday, the member for Sozel Saltibus made reference to a particular report which he insisted was on the desk of the Prime Minister. But what he neglected to tell the House, Mr. Speaker, that report was commissioned by the former member of Economic Development and the former parliamentary representative for Kashfi Southeast. And on page 162, Mr. Speaker, that very same report says, and I quote, "We do see a great value present in the works completed to date and believe the project is salvageable and could be converted into a facility that can properly serve the needs of St. Lucia." Mr. Speaker, I repeat that again. St. Jude's. The very same report that the member for Sozel referenced yesterday, on page 162, which he neglected to mention, says the following, and I quote, "We do see a great value present in the works completed to date and believe the project is salvageable and could be converted into a facility that can properly serve the needs of St. Lucia." They commissioned the report, Mr. Speaker, so they're fully aware of the terms and the words in the agreement. One did not wonder why the last administration never wanted the report to be laid in Parliament, as the very report which they quote from to defend their decision to abandon the buildings contradicts that very decision. We are all left to wonder whether they intend to spend 100 million or to build a hospital. Mr. Speaker, the evidence suggests that St. Jude's was a vehicle for a spending spree. And I'll stop here. I will let the rest of the information speak for itself. But it appears, Mr. Speaker, that it was a vehicle for a spending spree. Millions of dollars of materials and equipment bought for the project cannot be accounted for. The level of secrecy of the project undertaken by the last administration was so pronounced that not even the Ministry of Health officials were involved in the project. Mr. Speaker, how can you proceed to construct a hospital with no engagement with the Ministry of Health and other relevant stakeholders? And we heard the member for Sozel yesterday saying, move on with the consultation, no more consultation, just get on with doing it. It's a feature of what his government stood for. But the point is, you said consultation is not necessary to move on. That's what he said. Enough consultation.
Members, if you wish to rise on a point of order, please do
Mr.
so.
Mr. Speaker, how can you proceed to construct a hospital with no engagement with the Ministry of Health and other relevant stakeholders? Certainly, the former Minister of Economic Development possessed certain skills, but I don't think his expertise extended to hospital construction. My ministry will ensure that there is full engagement with all stakeholders. As at July 2021, when we came into office, only the structural shell and the external envelope of the 3 new buildings, the West Wing, dialysis and physiotherapy, were 80% complete. The project as a whole remained less than 30% complete, as there were minimal works to the inside of the buildings. No internal walls, Mr. Speaker. No doors, no plumbing, no electricity, no tiles, no ceiling, no telecommunications, an empty shell. And we are aware of the figures that were intended to be spent. Mr. Speaker, I won't go over that again. Mr. Speaker, the suggestions being presented by the Leader of the Opposition to the public that the new wing was close to completion when they left office is completely false and another figment of his imagination. Even the project manager of the contractor admitted that it would take a minimum of 18 months to complete. The last administration also had no approved budget for the completion of the hospital. And that is why they were rushing to sign the direct award for $70 million. However, even with that time frame, of the 18 months would be based on when the designs are completed, and there were no designs for the mechanical and electrical components, which is the most important aspect of a hospital. Mr. Speaker, no designs for the mechanical and electrical component, which is the most important aspect of our hospital. No design in place, no money to complete the building. Yet the former Minister of Economic Development said he was going to finish by December 2022. But we know what that means. Mr. Speaker, in the above context, the government was presented with two possible approaches in the completion of St. Jude's in the shortest possible time. One, the pursuit of establishing the hospital on the ground floor of the newly built structure as was being planned by the previous administration, and accept that the previous built structures should be abandoned, or alternatively, to use the best spaces created on the present facility. Mr. Speaker, the government has decided that the optimal approach would be to use the best spaces created over the last 10 years of construction activity to facilitate an early transfer from the George Odlum Stadium. The buildings that were demolished by the last administration had nothing to do with structural integrity. These buildings were demolished to create space for the new structures built. The dialysis building and the physiotherapy building, which were demolished and rebuilt, will now be incorporated into the proposed transition. Mr. Speaker, we have no intention of demolishing any structure or abandoning any structure at the St. Jude's Hospital for political purposes. The taxpayers of our country will not be abused by this government. Mr. Speaker, we intend to hold discussions with the Ministry of Health officials and the St. Jude's management to determine the best approach to incorporate the newly built wing in the creation of the St. Jude's Medical Complex. We now have a medical complex at St. Jude's, Mr. Speaker. The St. Jude's Medical Complex, when completed, will possess 263,000 square feet of build space. This administration builds, we do not demolish. We incorporate, we do not abandon. Every structure on St. Jude's land will be completed, and the South will have an excellent medical complex. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I want to repeat what I said in this Honorable House a few weeks ago. Mr. Speaker, while the members opposite would have considered quick fixes, short-term measures, and devised coping strategies to safeguard central government's revenues, our government's plan is about the people and their livelihoods. Mr. Speaker, this budget speaks to the economic transformation, poverty alleviation, job creation and empowerment, risk reduction, and citizen safety. Mr. Speaker, this government is bringing the wealth to the citizens. We are focused on preparing our youth, empowering them for bigger and better things to come. We are about improving living conditions, bringing quality services to our communities. The 2022-2023 national budget is, to my mind, one of the most important in the history of St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, we admit that our experiences, be they positive or negative, make us who we are. In that same manner, a country's experiences influences and shapes its future. Mr. Speaker, I wholeheartedly support the policy statements for the 2022-2023 budget. 2022-2023 budget. Devant ensemble. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Vieux-Fort North.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank the Holy Spirit for once again giving me the strength to represent the people of V4 North. And I want to thank all those who have been at my side before me and behind me to ensure that I do the best that I can in the constituency and with my responsibilities as Minister for Health, Wellness and Elderly Affairs. Speaker, I stand here today, I raise my hand and I roll up my sleeves. I join my Prime Minister and colleagues in this ambitious project of redirecting a nation where opportunity for all our people is our only priority, where we will empower our people and transform our economy. Mr. Speaker, I repeat our manifesto promise in putting you first on page 20, and I quote, "A St. Lucia Labour Party government will pursue a health policy that is patient-centered, evidence-based, equitable, accessible, and affordable." We also promise, Mr. Speaker, to engage the retired and the elderly. There are 11 areas of focus in the manifesto, and for us to achieve these goals, there must be deep reflection and action to reinvigorate the centers of responsibility for which we have oversight. All around St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, there are people who call daily with ideas, with suggestions, and who want to commit resources to the reorganization of our healthcare system. What we have can be improved, Mr. Speaker. We can do better. We deserve to give ourselves better. Our efforts will be focused, and my commitment is unwavering, Mr. Speaker. In this regard, I wish to thank the Permanent Secretary acting, Ms. Jenny Daniel, Ms. Rhys Inglis, the Deputy Permanent Secretary, the CMO, Dr. Belma George, and all of the staff of the Ministry of Health, Wellness and Elderly Affairs. I wish to thank the chairpersons of our various boards, Mr. Michel, the Millennium Heights Medical Complex, Mr. Elevic of the St. Jude Hospital, and the various board members, Mr. Speaker. I wish to thank very early on all the various councils, the doctors, nurses, and volunteers who work very hard to ensure that we keep this thing together, that we keep focused, Mr. Speaker. And I wish to thank the administrative staff, my own secretary, Ms. Florius, and all those who do the work to ensure that we keep the wheels turning. Mr. Speaker, I want to say to you that the strength on which I stand is from the people of V4 North. For them, I must and we must do what we have to do and do it well, because, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to health care and elderly affairs, every single one of us matter. And the people of my constituency, I wish to say to you that we will put our best foot forward. Mr. Speaker, it puzzles me, and I've said so before, that year in, year out, government comes in, government goes out, and we are unable, it seems, to solve the basic problems of an efficient healthcare system. It's puzzling, Mr. Speaker, because there are several initiatives, some of them costing millions and millions of dollars over the years, Mr. Speaker. And if you have to add up all of the figures, whether it be recurrent or capital, you'd notice, Mr. Speaker, that somehow, for some reason, efficient healthcare and the healthcare system of St. Lucia seem always to come up short. Pour ça, Mr. Speaker, l'année après l'année,
tout qualité projet qu'a fait à cette ici, gros projet qui a coûté millions de dollars, et qu'il y a chaque année, nous avons parlé about healthcare, universal healthcare, avec assez pas qu'a fait, Mr. Speaker. Why is this? I put it to you, Mr. Speaker, that we must find a way. We must find a way to prevent unruly and vindictive governments from changing plans midstream when they get into office. Mr. Speaker, since 1997, when the St. Lucia Labour Party government came into office, the focus on universal health care came into it became a sharp priority. If you look at the strategic plan coming out of the consultations of the year 2000, Mr. Speaker, you would note that the St. Lucia Labour Party government focused on the deliverables, which some of them, the new General Hospital, universal health care, a strategic plan for health, and all of these documents are there. But somehow, Mr. Speaker, when the United Workers' Party came into office, they simply dismantled the structures and our people continued to suffer. Why is it important for us to focus on health care, Mr. Speaker? More and more, Mr. Speaker, health care is being seen as a pillar of the economy. No longer would people think of health care simply as a social service. Pli, moun ki ka fè étude à la terre ka wè, zafè santé c'est un zafè qui est important à l'économie, Mr. Speaker. It is not just people who are sick and doctors with medication and so on and so forth. Let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, why all of us must get our hands and our energies into the healthcare enterprise in St. Lucia. Let me lay bare our situation, if you did not know, Mr. Speaker. The population pyramid for St. Lucia 2021 displays a progressively narrowing base over the past 2 decades, revealing signs of declining birth rates and an aging population. Pli en pli, Mr. Speaker, population cette lisi ka moutue, la ni pli grand moun en population, passé la ni jeune moun, laissez l'année à aller. Enfin, Mr. Speaker, conseil l'année à aller, nous ka wè moins moun ka fait en cette lisi, passé avant. And this is very, very critical. If we have to look at studies, Mr. Speaker, the recently concluded situational and response analysis, which was conducted by the Ministry of Health in 2020, suggests that the population, when you look at the population, Mr. Speaker, in 2020, an estimated 10% of the population is considered to be 65 years and older. That is 18,906 people, Mr. Speaker. And if you look at the comparisons, in 1991, Mr. Speaker, 8.8% of the population was considered to be 65 years and older. In 2001, 10%. In 2010, 12%. In 2017, 9.5%. And in 2020, 10%. What does that mean, Mr. Speaker? Overall life expectancy in 27 was 75.9 years, with women living slightly longer than men, 82.1 years, and 70 years for men. So, Mr. Speaker, this is very critical for our country. And any government, if you are going to develop your economic policies, si nous pouvons faire plan by pays, ou ni pour garder population, et garder qui manière population ka aller. And that is where you begin to see whether you're going to have challenges in the future, in the next 20 years, 30 years, and how you develop your plans in order to cope with these challenges. Why is this important? It is important because the St. Lucia Labour Party, having studied all of this, decided that we need to focus on elderly affairs as part of our priorities, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister decided that elderly affairs will become essential as we move forward. And when we came in, Mr. Speaker, we looked at the work which was done before. There is a national policy for older persons, a draft, in 2003. It was revised again in 2013. This policy, Mr. Speaker, highlighted several challenges with the elderly. But what has happened since then? Again, Mr. Speaker, it speaks to, over the years, we are not focused on what is critical for our people in relation to elder care, and therefore, when another government comes, the process slows down or halts. Mr. Speaker, currently, here is what we are doing. The government of St. Lucia seeks to review and update the national policy for older persons. We are currently carrying out consultations, and thanks to Dr. Zeister Edmond, who is leading these consultations, and the national dialogue has started, and I wish to thank the Prime Minister for his focus. We speak about what needs to be done, and I'm going to tell you at every instance what is happening currently, Mr. Speaker. So as we speak, Mr. Speaker, there are consultations taking place right now to ensure that we have a national policy for older persons, which will go to the Cabinet of Ministers and then laid in the Parliament of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. It will take a 10 to 12 week period. Ça veut dire, Mr. Speaker, nous disons, nous avons une campagne qui nous concerne les affaires Guamoun. Avec nous, pas un 10 ans en bouche, nous, là, nous avons tué un gouvernement. Premier ministre, là, il mettait moins, là, il prend responsabilité pour santé avec les affaires Guamoun. Il dit, nous n'y pour faire un policy pour Guamoun. Avec à présent, nous avons commencé à travailler là, avec Dr. Zeister Edmond, qui travaille tout au niveau pays cette ici, qui a parlé avec nous pour assurer qui nous fait policy cela. So very soon, Mr. Speaker, it will be coming to Parliament. We want to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that our policy promotes healthy lifestyles. It promotes an attitude of healthy aging. It promotes the capacity for caring for older persons and to ensure the quality of care at homes for older persons. Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister spoke to the programs for elder care, and we are hoping through the ministry with responsibility for equity, Mr. Speaker, that we will see some improvements. I have been to all but one of the elder care homes in St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, and every single one of them, at every single one of them, you see the commitment of the staff, the churches, and the volunteers who take care of our elderly. And I wish to congratulate them, Mr. Speaker. The staff of the Comfort Base in the Citizens' Home and the work which they are doing down there, I wish to thank them. Mr. Speaker, I want to tell you about actions, because after we visited the St. Lucy's Home and the Johnson's Home and so on, one of their main concerns is with food security, Mr. Speaker. And the nuns and so on, they were explaining to me that they can't get the elder folk involved in gardening if some assistance will be provided. You dis, Mr. Speaker, you know, c'est gros problème là, c'est manger. À ces cas-là, que c'est gros moun kawete. Parce que manger cher avec, si on s'a planté manger à eux-mêmes, c'est pas tous ces gros moun qui sont allés en jardin, mais à dans ces gros moun veulent planter manger. Some of them have really done a lot of work, Mr. Speaker. And what did we do? Immediately, Mr. Speaker, we got working, and my secretary, very efficient, we contacted the Taiwanese embassy and the Ministry of Agriculture, the minister with responsibility for agriculture. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, c'est pas blague Mercado. If you visit most of these elder homes right now, you will see, Mr. Speaker, that the Ministry for Agriculture has combined with the Ministry of Health and with support from the embassy, with the Taiwanese embassy, they have included the elder care homes in the HOOPS program, and right now there are green... I'm so happy, Mr. Speaker. If you go to these homes, Mr. Speaker, after our visit, you will see most of the elder care homes are now engaged in kitchen gardens with the assistance of the ministry. Thank you very much, Minister. Very therapeutic. Ek nou pa pa fè pièce go wash à la télévision. I wish to thank the Prime Minister because he spoke to me about the St. Lucy's Home. I will not tell you what he does for the St. Lucy's Home. He doesn't want people to know. But, Mr. Speaker, when I went to the St. Lucy's Home, the raving reviews about the Prime Minister, and immediately they said to me, Minister, you can help us with food. Contact the Ministry of Agriculture. And right now, let me thank the staff of the Ministry of Agriculture. They are now continuing to install kitchen garden shed facilities in the kitchen gardens. And very soon we will have a ceremony with the Taiwanese government there, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister spoke of empowering our people and transforming our economy. We must radically improve the positive outcomes in healthcare for all St. Lucians. When we do this, Mr. Speaker, we will transform our economy. The Prime Minister said in his speech, we will ensure every St. Lucian has access to affordable and good quality healthcare. Mr. Speaker, we spoke about universal healthcare. And just this morning, I attended a ceremony where, Mr. Speaker, the management of the Respiratory Hospital, Miss Nancy Francis, Dr. Alicia Eugene Ford, and the men at the Respiratory Hospital, they are now at Obel Serafin. And you know what's happening there? With Dr. Daniel and Professor Gray. They're having a wonderful workshop on men's health and men's issues, Mr. Speaker. I wish to congratulate them for their work. As we speak, this is going on. And I say so because, Mr. Speaker, in my conversations with one of the doctors, I remarked in my speech that every single year we hear about universal health care. Universal health care. From 2000, from the year 2000, the plans are there. I have so many reports, Mr. Speaker. There are reports from Dr. King, 2017, about the financing, the essential package of services. There are reports way back from Dr. Richie Haynes, 2005. There are reports from ministers of health from way back when, Mr. Speaker. But for some reason, we have not, as a country and as a government, been able to say, no, healthcare is important, and come high or low water, we are going to implement it. For some reason, Mr. Speaker, there is always a reason for us not implementing universal health care. Oh, it's too expensive. Oh, the economy is not good enough. And oh, we will not be able to collect the taxes. But we collect taxes, we implement all kinds of things. We want to spend $600 million on an airport. We take millions to bring horses down. All kinds of things. We pay for vaccines, for all kinds of things, and we're waiting to get our complete $7 million. All kinds of things we get money for. But for some reason, we can't seem to even begin the implementation and the continuation of universal health care. When the Labour Party was in government, Mr. Speaker, we started incrementally with diabetes and hypertension, medication being given with no cost out of pocket. The EWP came in and things were changed. Mr. Speaker, we cannot continue as a country to place health care on the back burner anymore. We are not going to accept the excuses of we don't have money, we don't know where to find it, we don't know which tax to use, but we can find money for everything else. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has charged me and he has said to me, we are going to get you the money, but get organized and organize the universal health care. We are going to get the money. And so, Mr. Speaker, no more excuses. Another doctor told me this morning, what are you all doing with St. Jude? So when I explained to him, he said to me, Musa, you know something? I like you a lot. But if you don't implement, if St. Jude is not finished, I'll be at the forefront to mobilize to vote you all out. Now that is the attitude of St. Lucians. This is the attitude of St. Lucians. And it's a positive attitude. I'm a politician, I always want to win elections. But no longer, although I've always won so far. And I'll definitely win again. While all others go to London. We're going to London, we have work to do. But Mr. Speaker, what we are saying is, he gone. Mr. Speaker, what we are saying there is, gouvernement après gouvernement, les bâteurs gouvernement, nous commençons à bailler moun qui diabetes, hypertension, ati soulagement, qui a commencé universal healthcare. Mais ça, quand tu as cassé, moi, comme ministre santé, c'est, là, moi, regarder un ministre là, avec moi, des permanent secrétaire pour moi, tout rapport, Mr. Calix, Dwight Calix, moi, pour voir tout rapport, permanent secretary, Miss Jenny Daniel, tout rapport. And when I look at the reports, Mr. Speaker, it's heartbreaking. We spent thousands and thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in consultancies. We have experts in St. Lucia, expert doctors, expert psychologists, some of the best in the world. If you go to Tapion and Victoria and the hospitals, and you look at the citations of our doctors and our nurses are going all over the world. We have the expertise. It's not for want of better expertise, but we have not had a continuous political will, continuous. We have not had a continuous political will to implement universal health care. I want to say to you, Mr. Speaker, that whatever time God gives me in the politics, and as long as the Prime Minister wishes, I will be steadfast and we will implement universal health care. I guarantee you that. God willing. Mr. Speaker, what are we going to do? First of all, we must admit that universal health coverage is not a one-time show. It cannot be. All the research suggests that countries which are much more developed than us, South Korea, and I read the reports of so many countries, they started 20 years ago. Some countries started in 1971, and up to now, they have not concluded or come to a point where they can say they have achieved complete universal health coverage. So we are not trying to fool people and say, oh, everybody will get free medication for everything. Because universal health coverage is much more than just medication. So we are going to tell the people of St. Lucia exactly what we will do, the steps that we will take. And so the people of St. Lucia can evaluate, they can judge. After year one, what should happen? And if it didn't happen, come back to tell us. After year two, what should happen? I'm going to say to you, Mr. Speaker, that the difficulties which we have to modernize St. Lucia's healthcare sector include healthcare financing. Governments over the years have not provided enough money to the healthcare sector in St. Lucia. And if you look at the percentage of money we spend in our budget on healthcare compared to other Caribbean countries, we are one of the lowest. One of the lowest. There are others, but we are one of the lowest. So we must increase the amount of money we spend on healthcare. But I cannot go to the Minister for Finance and say, I want $300 million if I cannot provide the Minister for Finance with the rationale. Why do you want the $300 million and how are we going to spend it? Poor management of non-communicable diseases, weak links between the budget health outcomes, making the quality and efficiency of public health outputs less than optimal. I spoke to a gentleman, I'll not mention his name because I don't know if I should. But I spoke to a well-known gentleman, a patriot, who lost his wife under tragic circumstances, and he was trying to get information out of the healthcare system. And when he came to my office, it really saddened me. He said to me, Mr. Minister, I'm going through pain. But the pain which I'm going through is not to say we don't have doctors or we don't have facilities. He said it's not the facilities. He said, yes, we have to reconstruct St. Jude. That's important. But it's not just the facilities. It's that the system, the healthcare system, must show that it cares about people. The system. And therefore, we must focus on quality of outcomes. And that we are going to focus on. Mr. Speaker, we have gone to cabinet, and the cabinet of ministers led by our Prime Minister has given his blessings to do the following. And I'm going to tell you exactly how we are going to begin universal health care. Exactly. The first thing we are going to do is we are going to use the performance-based financing pilot project as phase 1 of the implementation of UHC. This project is already within a World Bank project which we have. So as I go on, Mr. Speaker, you'll realize what I'm trying to explain. We are going to mobilize all of our functions within the healthcare sector, the Ministry of Health, our partners, to focus on universal health care. And so you realize we are not reinventing the wheel. You realize we are not breaking things down and trying to start all over again. What we are trying to do, Mr. Speaker, is to take the different parts of this vehicle, which we have found all over the place, and put it together and put a proper driver at the wheel to ensure we move UHC together and forward. So first, we are going to use the performance-based financing. We are going to proceed to encourage St. Lucians to register into the St. Lucia Health Information System service. That's the second thing. Third, we will work on the issuance of a health card. Fourth, we will add maternal and child health services, dialysis, and early cancer diagnosis to the first phase of the UHC initiative. Right now, we already have diabetes and hypertension. We will create a universal healthcare coverage unit to support the implementation of universal health care within the ministry. We have sought and received the approval of Cabinet for the creation of the Universal Health Coverage Special Fund. So, Mr. Speaker, I have told you exactly what we're going to do. So when I come here next year, or even before next year, I'm going to report to the people of St. Lucia on the success or challenges of what we're going to do. So I've told you exactly what the St. Lucia Labour Party government will do. So premièrement, nous avons servi un programme qui a dans World Bank, à Golon, nous te pour avec World Bank là, nous avons créé performance-based financing. This means, Mr. Speaker, that when our clients visit our health and wellness centers or our primary care facilities and they seek assistance for diabetes or hypertension or maternal health and so on, we are going to ensure that they are part of the database, provide them with the services, and we are going to assess these services. We will know in 6 months' time, Mr. Speaker, we will know how this program works so that we can be in a better position to have a cost of essential health services. Because studies have been done before, but we need to update those studies. Mr. Speaker, nous avons regardé les affaires health card. Et nous avons mis les affaires madame qui go boudé, les affaires dialysis, les affaires cancer, et aussi nous voulons faire un unit en ministry, un petit groupe, Mr. Speaker, et travailler seulement sur universal health care. Et le cabinet là, moi mené en consultation en cabinet là, avec le cabinet là, ça d'accord, nous allons faire un special fund pour universal healthcare coverage. So, Mr. Speaker, we are focused on bringing together all the resources of the ministry to ensure that we achieve this phased approach to universal health care. There have been a number of steps, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 5 years, the last government explored the idea of implementing a national health insurance. The last government wanted to have this health insurance through a private health insurance provider. They said they would cover the vulnerable population, and the rest of the population with the ability to pay would buy into the insurance package. Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted some of the issues with this income-based system of health coverage. And there are many lessons all around the world. There are many lessons in the more developed countries, in the developing countries. And so, Mr. Speaker, we choose not to go in that direction. The economy as well as the fiscal position of the government is still, these are still being impacted by COVID-19, and we believe that measured steps leading to the achievement of our goal is the best way to go. The phased implementation is the best way to go, Mr. Speaker. So US $4 million will be spent on this to begin the process, Mr. Speaker, and we are hoping that the lessons will help us. Now, some people will say to you, but diabetics and hypertensive people go to the health centers now and they get services and medication. But we are going to move one step further with the PBF and engage the private sector. So those people who need to take blood tests and so on in private labs, we are going to have contracts signed with the private labs, and we are going to use this as a model to ensure that we can cost the health system. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Health utilizes the health system, the SLUIS as it's called, to register patients. Of late, Mr. Speaker, we have had some updating of the system. Some data entry clerks were employed to clean up the system, to delete duplicate entries. A systems developer and a database manager were hired to support the PBF pilot, and they are doing some great work. As a result of this recent work, Mr. Speaker, approximately 60% of the estimated population in St. Lucia is deemed to have been registered in the system as of December 2021. It is now possible to determine the number of persons with diabetes and hypertension registered in each wellness center and the number of persons registered from the catchment population. In other words, Mr. Speaker, it does not make sense to simply implement universal health care and you do not have an efficient data management system which will give you information and which will help you. We have a serious problem which is developing in St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. We realize over the past few years that there's been growing concern over the rise in infant mortality. And we are hoping to assist mothers. Currently, Mr. Speaker, pregnant mothers are able to get services at the wellness centers with no out-of-pocket payments. However, as I said before, lab investigations, ultrasounds, and so on must be done out of pocket. Ça veut dire, c'est maman, même si on allait à health center, et que on est docteur, et que on joue un petit remède, si on y pour faire un ultrasound, ou bien si on peut faire un blood test qui sortit à de l'autre lab privé, on y pour payer l'argent. Ça nous qu'a faire, bah c'est madame là qui go boudin, les programmes là commencé, yo pas qu'à ni pour payer, même si on allait à de lab privé. We are taking the incremental steps. And as I said before, Mr. Speaker, we are creating a special unit for that. We note, Mr. Speaker, that there are about 2,000 young people in St. Lucia, females, who are being serviced at the maternal clinics every year. So we know the cost. It will cost us about $1,560,000 to include maternal and child health. Ça veut dire $1.5 million pour nous, madame qui go boudin, pour nous mettre un programme Universal Healthcare avec nous. Qui fait ça, Mr. Speaker? So, Mr. Speaker, we are doing incremental. We are moving in that direction. I will announce to you very soon, Mr. Speaker, our plans for our elderly folk who are on the side of Soleil Couché. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that having attained a certain age, when our people access our public services, they should not pay out of pocket. We believe so, Mr. Speaker. The work is being done, and as I said before, we will start incrementally. We believe, Mr. Speaker, and I know that the acting PS is doing a lot of work on this. She too is very excited about that. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that medical exemption cards or medical exemptions should be applied very soon or almost immediately to anyone who's 90 years and above. We are going to make an announcement very soon on the start date of this as we continue to consult and continue to get the information. And so, Mr. Speaker, while we have issues with our healthcare system in St. Lucia, there are so many opportunities. Cancer, for example, Mr. Speaker, the #1 killer in St. Lucia can be tackled. We can continue our awareness program. Look at what's happening with cancer awareness, the St. Lucia Cancer Society, Mr. Speaker. I had a brief discussion with Dr. Ramey, and also you can see what is happening with Faces of Cancer, which was formed in 2009, and Mrs. Dorothy Skid Phillip and her team. They are all around St. Lucia with the Ministry of Health and other partners and doctors and so on, continuing to educate our people in relation to cancer. Look at what has happened with men's awareness in St. Lucia. We have opportunities, Mr. Speaker, and I'm excited about these opportunities to cause our men in particular. As we know, prostate cancer is the #1 killer. While cancer is our #1 killer in St. Lucia, prostate cancer, Mr. Speaker, is the #1 killer. Because un homme, moi vle regarder pour un saison côté un kay gouvernement qui tue concerné à les affaires prostate là, avec cancer à prostate là, avec te pas avec parler, nous kay mener attention pour les affaires cancer, avec nous kay fait ça. The Cancer Registry, and I wish to thank the doctors and nurses who are passionate about this cancer registry. Dr. Francois, Mr. Speaker, very passionate lady about the cancer registry, and we have started or continued consultations. I know for many years, there's been talk about the cancer registry, and there are benefits to the cancer registry. We must do it, Mr. Speaker. Again, as Minister, I continue to say that a number of these things were on documents from 2001, 1997, and so on, but there's not been enough focus. And this is what I bring to the table, Mr. Speaker. I bring focus and the passion to get it done, the commitment to get it done. So the cancer registry, Mr. Speaker, we are going to focus on it. I want to say there are opportunities, Mr. Speaker. Non-communicable diseases. While we must mention the percentage of people who die from diabetes and hypertension-related causes, I want to be a minister, Mr. Speaker, who speaks about the opportunities and what we are going to do. We are going to re-establish the National Commission on Chronic Non-Communicable Diseases, Mr. Speaker. We have gone to Parliament, to Cabinet a few weeks ago, and I want to thank Dr. Sear, who is working on this, and I've given her my commitment. The 2005 National Strategic Plan for Health, out of the 2005 National Strategic Plan for Health, non-communicable diseases were identified as one of the priorities. And work was done on it. In 2017, the ministry, along with PAO, established a multi-sectoral action plan, and that plan is there. What I'm going to do, as I said, Mr. Speaker, is to focus, laser focus, to achieve results. Why must we do this? Pourquoi ça pour nous garder les sécurité disease là, comme diabetes, high blood pressure, et comme ça? You know why, Mr. Speaker? In 2008, 71% of our deaths because of non-communicable diseases. Okay? High blood pressure, cancer, all these things. By 2014, it went to 81%. By 2016, 82%. Mr. Speaker, you know what it means? And we talk about the economy. And more people in healthcare are talking about the impact of healthcare on the economy. And you cannot speak about economic growth if you don't talk about healthcare. You cannot. And I'm going to ensure, Mr. Speaker, in my term, that healthcare is spoken of just like you speak about GDP and fiscal measures and so on. That is what's going to happen, Mr. Speaker. You know what? Let me tell you, Mr. Speaker. The research says that in the population, people aged 16 to 64, 16 years to 64 years, non-communicable diseases, cancer, diabetes, stroke, and so on, let me put it a very simple way. It took away 24.7 years of productive life from men in St. Lucia. So think about that, Mr. Speaker. Think about that. Men in St. Lucia who have diabetes or cancer and those kinds of things, 24 years of their life, of their working life, was taken away. They can't work, Mr. Speaker. Now, if you have that, how can you even talk about economic growth without a strong labor force? And men, and for ladies, they lost about 24 years of their productive life. Now, Mr. Speaker, so what could ça bien? C'est qu'à dire c'est raison nous ne pouvons pas parler de cancer, diabetes, raison c'est bagay ça là important parce que nous pas ça ni pièce développement économique si nous pas parler des affaires santé. Ça étude là qu'a dit nous, c'est mon qui mort avec stroke avec diabetes, obésité ni pas moun qui mort, moun qui ni malade là. Puis ça dou avec bail comme ça, c'est nom là l'année 24 l'année ou ka perdre 24 l'année ou ka perdre qui ou passe à travail. Et c'est madame là l'année alors 23 ou 24 l'année ou ka perdre. Comme ça c'est important. Mr. Speaker, obesity, serious problem. So we're not here to talk about all of the statistics only. The doctors know it. The Department of Health, especially the education, public education section, they put out, whether it be education, videos all the time. We know that obesity is a big problem. In 2012, Mr. Speaker, a study showed that between the ages 25 to 64, 53.9% of men were overweight in St. Lucia, 77.1% of females. It must be higher now. And if you are overweight, Mr. Speaker, you are looking at problems, possibly cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on. How much are we losing to these in our economy? Mr. Speaker, I want to say to you that this government is focused. I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the hospitals will also be in focus. And I've thanked the various boards of the hospitals. We have a new board at the Millennium Heights Medical Complex under the chairmanship of Mr. Michel and Deputy Chair Dr. Stanley Jean. And they are working, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the hospital meets its objectives. I don't want to say too much at this stage, Mr. Speaker, because they are reviewing several processes. They are also reviewing the work of a consultant which was hired by the last government, and the Prime Minister said the amount of over $4 million, and much more will be said about that soon, Mr. Speaker. I'm not one to speak out of turn. I want all my facts and all my figures. I want to say to the staff and management of the Millennium Heights Medical Complex that we are working with you. We are going to ensure that the efficiencies come, and we are going to ensure that your budget matches what you need to do at the hospital. Mr. Speaker, St. Jude Hospital is a QEV chair, as a doctor told me this morning. Many doctors told me many things this morning, Mr. Speaker. St. Jude Hospital is a QEV chair. I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that many of my colleagues have spoken about St. Jude Hospital. The Prime Minister, the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, they have spoken about the St. Jude Hospital. And today I will not speak much about the St. Jude Hospital. I want to say to the staff, patients, and the board the new board of the St. Jude Hospital, that we are committed to ensuring your safety, and we are committed to ensuring progress at the hospital. Mr. Speaker, I must tell you that the reports which I have in my possession do not speak.
Member for Vivo North, you have 15 minutes left.
The reports do not speak well of the stewardship at the hospital in the past. There are several things which must be corrected, Mr. Speaker, and at the correct time, I will let you know what these are. But I want to thank the board, Mr. Elevic and Mr. Norman Edward, for their work, Chair and Vice Chair, and the rest of the board. And I want to thank Mistress Altifoy, and board members for their quick action when one of the canopies, the one at the eastern end of the hospital, started to give way. And quick action caused that canopy to be removed, and the other one will be removed. Mr. Speaker, the respiratory hospital, again, I want to pay tribute to Dr. Alicia Ford Eugene and Miss Nancy Francis and all the staff for their work during the heights of the COVID-19 pandemic, their sacrifices and all of what they had to endure. I have said to you before, Mr. Speaker, what we had to do to cause there to be better conditions at the respiratory hospital. The doctors made sacrifices. The porters made sacrifices. All the medical staff made sacrifices. And those doctors in the private sector who assisted at the Victoria or the respiratory hospital need to be commended. Mr. Speaker, I want to say to you, Mr. Speaker, that a comprehensive assessment is being made of all of our health and wellness centers. And the Larry Shoes Health Center, Mr. Speaker, which was spoken to by the parliamentary representative, will get assistance, Mr. Speaker, will get repaired. As we move on, Mr. Speaker, as a country trying to survive with COVID-19, we are going to ensure that 8 broad areas are looked at. We want to ensure that we continue to build a resilient health system, that the governance for health is strong, execute an effective vaccination campaign, continue to spread the message of slowing the spread through our public health standards and measures. We want to ensure that schools, businesses continue to operate safely. We want to ensure that we protect people at highest risk. We want to ensure that we increase public compliance with the protocols. We know, Mr. Speaker, that we must successfully coexist with COVID-19. It requires the whole of society, and it requires all of us to be united in this effort. I want, Mr. Speaker, to continue to thank all those who made sacrifices, all those who lost loved ones and continue to suffer. We continue to express condolences. As we've said before, every single one of us around this table may have lost a relative, a friend, to COVID-19. Every single one of us. So this has become a scar in our memories, in our lives, and we will work together to ensure that we move on from this. Mr. Speaker, we have a crisis in our pharmacy, in the area of pharmacy. There are many pharmacies, Mr. Speaker, which have to close temporarily because of the lack of pharmacists. I want to raise this as an issue which we will definitely tackle, Mr. Speaker. There are a number of reasons for this, and we will. Mr. Speaker, I wish to focus on what I call our health ecosystem, our partners. And I want to spend some time to say to you that apart from the doctors and the Ministry of Health and the hospitals and so on, there is a whole health ecosystem which requires governments to pay more attention to, and which requires us to cause them to be more integral partners in the healthcare development in St. Lucia. HelpAge, for example, the National Council for and for Older Persons. People like Mrs. Gerald Lebre from the St. Lucia Planned Parenthood Association, Mr. Speaker. The work which is being done by Mr. Anthony Avril of the St. Lucia Blind Welfare Association, operating clinics at low cost for St. Lucians. The St. Lucia Sickle Cell Association with Ms. Sophia Harry and her team. The Child Development Center, Dr. Kim Gardner Sadhu. They receive over 500 referrals per year, Mr. Speaker, with children 0 to 5 years with developmental delays or at risk, faces of cancer. And you see the work of Mrs. Dorothy Phillip and the rest of her team all around St. Lucia. Medication, tests, and so on with their health fairs. And all of the doctors, Mr. Speaker, and nurses who sacrifice their weekends to ensure that we come together to assist. They have serious concerns about space for oncology at our hospitals, where cancer patients sometimes share waiting areas with other patients and so on, the need for radiation, issues with our own processes, where cancer drugs, Mr. Speaker, sometimes take an inordinate on a long time to get to St. Lucia. We have serious problems which we must keep focusing on, keep the focus on. We have spoken about nursing, Mr. Speaker, and this is a major problem and a major headache for the healthcare sector in St. Lucia. While it's a headache, Mr. Speaker, there are also opportunities. The nursing sector, Mr. Speaker, continues to suffer because so many countries know that our nurses are well trained, they are valuable, and Mr. Speaker, people from all over, from England, from the United States of America, institutions are lowering our nurses, Mr. Speaker. We note that in St. Lucia, there are about 679 nurses in active service, 74% of them in the public sector. Mr. Speaker, we have an acute shortage of nurses. At OKEUH, we need another 95. At the St. Jude Hospital, Mr. Speaker, nous besoin lot 20, another 20-something nurses. In community nursing service, another 36. Respiratory hospital requires another 20-something nurses. How have we been able to deal with that? The government and people of Cuba, Mr. Speaker, once again come into focus, and they have been helping us and assisting us, and we should thank the government and people of Cuba. Where are our nurses going, Mr. Speaker, as I close? In the year 2019, we had a big blow. 109 nurses left. The United Kingdom, 55 of them left. The United States, 44. Bermuda, 7 Cayman Islands, and a few other countries. In 2020, 52, 2021, 63, and so far, Mr. Speaker, between January 2022 and April, 19 of them have left. And so, Mr. Speaker, do we throw our hands to the wind? What do we do? It costs an average of 40,000 EC dollars to train a nurse at the Sarah Louis Community College. We have said, Mr. Speaker, and the Prime Minister has repeated, that we will find a way so that our nurses are no longer on these 3-month contracts and 6-month contracts and 1-year contracts that they have to suffer with right now, Mr. Speaker. We will find a way, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Environmental Health Department is critical, and we are now reviewing our port health surveillance systems to ensure that environmental health comes back into focus, Mr. Speaker. I recall as a child the Environmental Health Division.
Member for Viewfort North, you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recall as a child that the Environmental Health Division was critical. That was almost, it was almost the face, Mr. Speaker, of the ministry, the Department of Health. And we are going, Mr. Speaker, to cause the Environmental Health Department to come into focus as the vanguard, because without their assistance and expertise, Mr. Speaker, we are going to have problems with non-communicable diseases, all the connections to our issues, Mr. Speaker, the Environmental Health Department has to lead. So once again, Mr. Speaker, let it be written that on that day, April 26, 2022, the Member of Parliament for Castries East presented his first budget address to the people of St. Lucia and witnessed by the world. I congratulate our Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, my friend, the first leader from the Castries Basin since Comrade Sir George F.L. Charles to lead his party to victory in a general election. And what an exemplary Prime Minister he has been so far, Mr. Speaker. Look at his actions and policies. It is clear for all to see that our Prime Minister is very, 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 very different to the last Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. When you look at our fiscals, the state of the economy, Mr. Speaker, the last Prime Minister, GDP was declining from 2017 and a massive one in 2020. So when they talk about this growth is theirs, this growth is theirs, Mr. Speaker, I wish to once again commit my energies and my spirit and all of the love which has been given to me by the people of Viewfort North. I wish to commit all of that to this enterprise of a successful St. Lucia Labour Party government, Mr. Speaker. And as I said to you before, we must continue to account to the people of St. Lucia on the matter of health care. And I want to suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, and I know you know where I'm going with this, I want to suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, that the time has come for us to have a parliamentary committee on health care in this country, Mr. Speaker. The time has come. Because every time a government comes, some very good initiatives like universal health care, because a minister has his own idiosyncrasies, they change course and so on. The people have to hold these processes accountable. So if we have a committee, the people know they can come here, whether you are a businessman, a doctor, you can come here, there are questions to the minister, the government presents plans, and the whole country knows. So when the next government comes, even though I may not be the Minister for Health, when the next Labour Party government comes, and the Labour Party government continues, the next Minister for Health, or the next whoever it is, can account. And no one politician can decide to just shift gears like that. So I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the people of Viewfort North, and I wish this government well. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Viewfort South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my colleague next to me just mentioned that he noticed that Viewfort South is following Viewfort North. Second time, okay. But I just want to emphasize that this is never the case. It's always before north that follows before south. So I just want to confirm that this is not going to be habitual at all. Mr. Speaker, many will argue that the budget policy statement, which we heard last Tuesday evening, is a perfect policy statement for the times. Perfect because, Mr. Speaker, you know, we're all recovering from the after effects of COVID. It doesn't seem to have an end. The events that are following in Ukraine, the unique challenges facing the Eastern Caribbean states, and of course the peculiar circumstances in which we find ourselves. There can be no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that the statement was delivered with erudition, passion, clarity, and focus. In my books, the member for Castries East has learned well. There may be reluctance to admit these things, but then you know, Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, there may be reluctance to admit these things. This is understandable. But of course, actions do speak much louder than words. So we have the actions to judge. And Mr. Speaker, there is a lot of merit in that view. After the battering of the past 2 years inflicted both by the COVID pandemic and the former administration, the economy appears to be on a path of rebound, a path of recovery. It must be a recovery that must be carefully watered and nourished if it is to be sustained. Unquestionably, Mr. Speaker, this is not a time to suffocate the economy, to imprison the economy. It needs to grow rapidly and quickly. And just look at the record of the announcements, Mr. Speaker. No new taxes. Instead, we have seen unprecedented generosity. Some long overdue reforms have been made to the personal income tax regime. Persons who owed taxes prior to 2000 have been forgiven. Penalties and interest on taxes owed by corporations and individuals between 2000 and 2015 will be waived. My only area of concern, Mr. Speaker, is that in this system that we have, we always seem to be rewarding the delinquents. And those who are imprisoned, whose incomes are always seen and controlled, always have to pay the taxes, but somehow those who flout our laws with impunity are the ones who seem to be rewarded. And someday, sometime, as the government reflects on this, I do hope that some concession will also be found to apply to those who have been so faithful to the system that we have created. Mr. Speaker, the list goes on. Traveling public officers who purchase new vehicles will receive 10,000 discount on duties and taxes. Grants and soft loan funding will be provided for the youth economy, for micro, small, and medium-sized businesses, and for community-based tourism. And these have been summarized, I think, all at page 64 of the budgetary statement. Former workers of Majestic and Liat will be compensated by the government, even though in the case of the Liat workers, the government was not the employer. One can only hope, Mr. Speaker, that that is not a precedent for the future. In the absence of resources, the Minister of Finance has wisely, in my view, opted to go for a policy of expansion, at least in the short term. Mr. Speaker, I will not, of course, comment in detail on the tax proposals, since nearly identical proposals were made in the budget address of May 12, 2015. There are, however, two key differences in the proposals made by the Minister of Finance. The 2015 budget restatement made provision for 2 tax bands and limited the allowable deductions to a maximum of $25,000. In the current proposals, we have 3 tax bands and allowable deductions of $30,000. These differences do not, in my view, Mr. Speaker, derail the intention behind the proposals announced by the Minister of Finance, and I believe ought to be welcomed by all. Indeed, even the former government, albeit under the instructions and guidance of Ernst & Young, had proposed major reforms to the income tax regime in the very direction that these amendments have been made. And I do recall a conversation when there were proposals to reform the tax regime during the reign of the former government, of discussion with the member for Castries South. I was drawing his attention to the fact that the tax proposals being made by the former government was in fact quite consistent with the tax proposals, almost repeating at the time, word for word, some of the language used in the 2015 tax proposals. In other words, committing blatant plagiarism, because I was not given credit for the language that was used in the proposals, Mr. Speaker. But then it seems that that is common in parliamentary history. I know the member for Castries North is very careful and he wouldn't take that risk. So, Mr. Speaker, there ought not to be unnecessary dispute and contention in this House, albeit that the capacity for contention has been severely restricted and reduced by the electorate. But frankly, Mr. Speaker, I think, Mr. Speaker, that there is a page in which common intentions are easily identified. But for me, Mr. Speaker, the most worrying disclosure was the debt to GDP ratio inherited by this government. I am concerned. And clearly the current Minister of Finance cannot, under any circumstances, be blamed. That is his inheritance. And to his credit, he has avoided unnecessary borrowing in the last 9 months of this government. But more to the point, Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Finance disclosed that the current level of public debt now stands at 90.6% of GDP, of some $4.13 billion. That, Mr. Speaker, if you want reference, can be found at page 58. A figure, Mr. Speaker, also confirmed in the Social and Economic Review for 2021. This figure means that we were lied to by the former administration, that it never told the truth about the exact debt to the GDP ratios in the country. And so now we have an opportunity to examine in clarity and with clarity, Madam Clerk, the various figures that have been presented to us. When all is said and done, Mr. Speaker, this is a very deep hole. It is a deep hole, Mr. Speaker. It is true that as the economy recovers, the debt to GDP ratio will decline, provided, of course, that the debt figure is accurate and includes all debt incurred by the government. And this has to be an issue, Mr. Speaker, because there are differences in this chamber about what should be included in the debt figures and what should be excluded. And this has nothing to do with the political directorate, Mr. Speaker, but everything to do with the thinking of the bureaucrats and civil servants entrusted with the management of public finances. So, Mr. Speaker, it remains unclear what has been added and what has been excluded from the debt figures by those who compile the information. For example, it was a practice of the former government, based on the advice of a former director of finance, to exclude from the debt portfolio the outstanding amounts on direct purchase contracts. It has been the view of the party that forms this government, unless that view has been changed, that those direct purchase contracts are in fact loans. and we do have a problem on our hands at the moment, that many of the direct purchase contracts issued in the past 5 years have not received the blessing of this Parliament and do not enjoy protection. And the implications of not enjoying protection has to be understood in any future adjustment that has to take place in respect of our debt portfolio. That having been said, for example, and quoting from the Minister of Finance, the amount of $185 million was contracted by the former government through direct purchase. And it is immaterial to reply to the government that, look, the former Labour government also issued direct purchase contracts. But while that is the case, the truth of the matter is that the direct purchase contracts of significant amounts always came to this House to receive the blessing and protection of this House, and thereby to receive protection in the event that it becomes necessary for any adjustments to be made of any kind. That's not so. That is not the case. And I see my good friend, the Attorney General, listening and watching me intently and mentally figuring, well, is he trying to give me more work than I already have? He's always a problem. He's always adding things to my portfolio. But I think he knows exactly what I'm talking about, and he'll do well to have a proper legal assessment of whether these contracts are enforceable in law, since they do not enjoy the protection of guarantees issued by this House. Then, too, it needs to be ascertained whether the disbursed amount for the Hiwanora International Airport has been included. And we were told that a significant sum has already been spent for the preparatory works of the Hiwanora International Airport. And God forbid when the day comes when the figures for the Hiwanora International Airport have to be included, then understand, and every St. Lucian needs to understand that your debt figures will go over 100% of GDP. You know, Mr. Speaker, it has been lost on St. Lucians what this means, what this issue of debt means. And you know, this gives me an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to put to rest an issue that was thrown at me from the opposition benches on this side in the last 5 years. So much was thrown at me, Mr. Speaker. Never say that. I will not ever accept a description of Paul Jack. Don't apply to me. That applies to others. So don't ever say that. But you know, Mr. Speaker, the point that I want to make, Mr. Speaker, the point that I want to make, Mr. Speaker, these things are constantly thrown at you, I mean, repeatedly, time and time again. You know, told that you can't manage the economy. You made a disastrous job of the economy. And notwithstanding that, I heard some interesting defenses coming from the government and explanations pointing out that every time there has been need to stabilize the economy and put it in a safe direction, it has always taken a Labour government to do it. And I will go down in history as the Prime Minister who made sure that I made the adjustments in this economy to save it. I will go down in history. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I recall in the last couple of years when I made a statement on a program to the effect that, look, if we do not restructure our debt, if we do not deal with our revenue issue, Mr. Speaker, we will find that our government instruments become unattractive and nobody is going to buy government instruments. Do you know what the proselytizers, those who proselytize on behalf of the current opposition, interpreted that to mean that I made a public statement that St. Lucia could not borrow or could not pay? I never said anything like that. And they said, you know, people who are supposed to be more learned, you know, people who are supposed to have a command of information. And they say it with impunity because you don't reply, you don't take them on. What I did say was that if we do not deal with our revenue issues, if we do not convince borrowers that we are able to meet our commitments, they are not going to buy our instruments. So what did we do? I took the pay, I introduced VAT, our revenue streams changed dramatically, revenue came in, and immediately we sent a signal. Now, there was a point, Mr. Speaker, when the officials, and I'll disclose this today, when the officials of the Ministry of Finance were so alarmed after we got into office, so alarmed, Mr. Speaker, about our ability to pay our debts and to roll over our instruments, our treasury bills, etc., that they came to me and said, Prime Minister, we recommend that you go to the IMF now and begin to negotiate a standby agreement. I did share that with the cabinet, contrary to what some may want to suggest. And you know, Mr. Speaker, they gave me a list of adjustments that would be critical and crucial. But their big fear was that sometime around July, August, we had hundreds of millions of dollars on treasury bills and short-term instruments that had to be redeemed that would not be appealable. When I recognized that that was the main issue, Mr. Speaker, I went off to Trinidad and Tobago and held discussions with the then government of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Speaker. And I asked for a loan of $45 million to meet those commitments. And to coincide, Mr. Speaker, with the introduction of VAT so we could have met our commitments. Fortunately, the government of St. Lucia had an excellent relationship with the government of Trinidad and Tobago. They made the money available to us, and we met our commitments and proceeded with the changes, and then we began to reap the benefits. Now, Mr. Speaker, I say these things because the passage of history does not sometimes record events of material significance. You have to search for history sometimes. History is not necessarily what is obvious, Mr. Speaker. There is so much of history that is created every day, but that is unseen. Now everybody is looking at me as if to say, what does he have in his mind? Mr. Speaker, I'm just making a simple statement of truth. Every single individual around this table has a history that is unseen and unknown. No, I know the member for, look at that. Right away, the member for Swazel is lifting his eyes in the air and he's trying to see if he can remember the history that is unseen and hidden. So, Mr. Speaker, to come back to these salient points, the point one is trying to make here is this, that if this loan goes through and it is disbursed and have to be added, then the debt to GDP ratio will just not inch, will increase by leap and bounds. And these are things we must invest in and explain to our people to guide our actions in the years ahead. It is true that some explanation has been provided in the Economic and Social Review, and honorable members are invited to look at page 15. But these explanations do not answer the principal concerns. What resonates, Mr. Speaker, is that there is no doubt that the capacity to borrow for investment will now be severely limited and constricted. Because what will happen is that lenders will first of all take a look at your debt to GDP ratio and say, but hey, can you realistically pay back this loan when it is due? And while legislation on debt control and management will be helpful, it certainly will not cure the problem. The horse has already bolted. Mr. Speaker, in the rest of my presentation, after these preliminary remarks and observations, I want to speak on three themes. First, the problem of implementation of proposals, and I will address an issue of bureaucracy, or what I perceive to be an issue of bureaucracy. Mr. Speaker, I will then follow this up with some brief comments on two major projects that have been announced, projects that are dear to my heart, Mr. Speaker. And then I want to come to a section I have described in these words: the little things matter. The things that we forget in budgetary statements but impact on the livelihood of our citizens, things that get them angry, upset, irritated, that we have to constantly address and resolve. So you need to be very patient with me, Mr. Speaker, as I go through this, because for me, every statement of a budget now becomes important and significant. As I have said, the windows of my political life are beginning to close, so when I speak, there's so much that I would wish to address and deal with, and of course, even resolve the historical record, because there's so much I have allowed in the past to be said, to which I have never replied publicly. And so I will step on some toes as we progress, as I reply to some of those things, and some of the individuals, Mr. Speaker, who have championed and articulated those things. But leave it out for the time being. Mr. Speaker, the fate of the proposals, the laudable proposals in this budgetary statement will, of course, be determined by the bureaucracy charged with their implementation. The question will be, Mr. Speaker, whether the proposals will become victims of the all too familiar bureaucratic lethargy and inertia that has now gripped and consumed decision-making in this country. And this is not a problem just for this government. It has been a problem for previous governments. It was a problem even for Sir John Compton in his heyday. Because I'll never forget his words to me after he visited me after the general election of 1997. Good luck with your proposals with the current civil service that you have. Those words have always resonated. To the credit of the Minister of Finance, he is aware of the problem, as he has announced that the youth economy will be managed through a statutory board with its own board of directors, ostensibly, quote, to avoid unnecessary bureaucracy and to allow for timely decision-making that is consistent with a modern business environment, unquote. And Mr. Speaker, if you wish me to be faithful, then you can look at page 14 of the statement. Mr. Speaker, I have often wondered, how did this proud little island, or should I say this once proud little island, once known for efficient, responsible, and responsive decision-making. Efficient, responsible, and responsive. They're different things. How is it that it surrendered its reputation and capitulated to bureaucratic inertia and decision? What happened to us? Why is it that now in this region we are no longer regarded as efficient, as progressive, as leading the pack? Why? What has happened to our decision-making processes that these things have happened? And you know, Mr. Speaker, if we don't deal with it, some endemic problems will remain. And these are the evils of bureaucracy. And they're well known, Mr. Speaker. The first is bureaucracy creates red tape. Red tape, sorry, Mr. Speaker. Lots of red tape. Always a red tape. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? When citizens are confronted with red tape, to resolve it, they offer favors and they offer bribes. And it is always the easiest way to create and encourage a culture of corruption. Bureaucracy and corruption walk hand in hand. Can I give the civil servants a favor to get some things done? How can I be nice to the civil servants if I want a document signed? These are the realities. That's how we nurse and create this culture of corruption. Bureaucracy stifles imagination. We don't understand that if we are not imaginative and creative, then we suffer because we don't search for ways and means to resolve the problems of citizens. You call, Mr. Speaker, and they tell you, well, you have to do this way, that way, you have to do this. Sometimes totally unnecessary and irrelevant. And bureaucracy, of course, gives you excessive checks and balances in the name of accountability. But accountability should not mean bureaucracy. We make a mistake about it. Accountability should never mean bureaucracy. Accountability should really mean whether the procedures that are put into place allow for the decision making to be done quickly and smoothly and without any evil being attached to it. That's what it means. It's time we refine the term accountability. And then, of course, you know, with bureaucracy, there's this culture of buck passing. Of culture, it's not me, it's my boss. It's the person who is head of the department. Not me, it's Mr. X or Miss X or Y, Mr. H or Miss X or Y. They're the ones who are causing the problem. And then, of course, you know, bureaucracy is about empire building. When you sit in that department of yours and you want to make yourself feel important and make the department feel important, then, of course, what you do is to build it up and you create a little empire of your own. So there are zones in the ministry, in the public service, you know, Mr. Speaker. There are zones and there are departments specialized, you know, that you have to behave in a certain way to get certain things done, you know, Mr. Speaker. Well, I mean, I can name several of them. Mr. Speaker. And this should never be, Mr. Speaker. We have lost this capacity to serve with integrity, with honor, with efficiency. What has happened to our little nation? What has happened to our country? Why are these things like that, Mr. Speaker? And then, of course, you and I know full well that bureaucracy protects the lazy and the incompetent because it avoids problem solving. You know, the problem, Mr. Speaker, is this. When an issue is presented, you apply the rules and the procedure. Follow the rules and follow the procedure. That's what it is, Mr. Speaker. But the decision maker does not say, well, you have a problem, this is what the rules say, but I think let us look for an alternative to see if we can solve your problem. We have abandoned the ability to solve. I don't know, I hear you all want to teach more mathematics in the schools and so on. I don't know if that will save you all. I don't know, Mr. Speaker. Because perhaps maybe if more mathematics is taught again, then people will have a different approach to problem solving. But if you want answers, come to the lawyers. They'll give you better guidance as to how you can solve problems. Attorney General, is that not so? It is, Mr. Speaker, a little wonder that St. Lucia has lost the reputation it once had for the best place to do business in the Caribbean. And, Mr. Speaker, when we acquired that reputation, I recall that the Speaker, the current Speaker now addressing you, happened to have held office, high office. That's when we had that reputation of the best place to do business in the Caribbean. And nobody here should contest that, you know. Because the fact, we have never recovered after the first few years. Never. And the part of the problem has been the creation of bureaucracy by the very agencies external to the government charged with making decisions on behalf of the government. And don't make the mistake, Mr. Speaker, to believe that the problem of bureaucracy, of frustrating citizens, of denying them the services they're entitled to is a problem associated with the government, you know. There are public companies engaged in the same process. They create a myriad of procedures that you must employ to get the services that are available. They are public companies, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? The culture is so fascinating, Mr. Speaker. As soon as we rid the state of one bureaucratic requirement, another is promptly created to replace what was lost. I have never understood it. And if you want a good example, and I want to tell the civils, don't feel that I'm attacking them. Don't get offended. I'm an onlooker, I watch, I apply for services too like everybody else. I remember when the government of the former Prime Minister Stephenson King was in office and they enacted legislation regarding civil status. The succeeding Labour government built on the legislation, reformed the legislation, introduced amendments, and one of the things he did was to confer a wide-ranging discretion on decision makers in the civil service registry, deliberately to empower them to resolve difficult cases. These days, when you apply for rectification, well, Crapo smoke your pipe, Mr. Speaker, because you have to make so many trips to that office. You know what? The civil servants entrusted with the discretion have become afraid to utilize the powers that they have. And I'm not criticizing them. Parliament gave them the powers. Parliament knew that you could not have answers to all the problems, and therefore said to them, look, don't harass citizens, frustrate citizens, make them go and look for records that don't exist. Use your discretion and solve it. But no, they don't, Mr. Speaker. So you go up and down, and as for me, I have to go and find money every couple of days to give people money to go up to Castries, to go and look for their civil status records, because we're not putting a civil status registry in the Beaufort for the people of Beaufort South. I can't do it anymore, Mr. Speaker. But that's the reality. And we have lost the capacity to be problem solvers, Mr. Speaker. We are problem creators. We must conduct a war on bureaucracy. Now, if I may, Mr. Speaker, go to familiar ground, and just to emphasize the point that I'm making. Just look for a moment at all the requirements to execute a deed of sale or hypothec, familiarly known as a mortgage. And you know, they even corrupt the language of our law. You know, they call, what should be called a hypothec in our law? They call it mortgage. It's just like, you know, I mean, a landlord. They don't understand that in our concept of law, we have a concept of ownership of land. They speak about interest in land. And the Attorney General should really also take time and don't let lawyers get away with this. They must be faithful to the law we prescribe. Both the vendor and purchaser must obtain a certificate of compliance to confirm there are no tax liabilities to Inland Revenue. So you have to go, apply for a certificate of compliance, and when you get the certificate. No, it doesn't stop there, you know. Then too, a certificate must be obtained from the National Insurance Corporation to confirm that no obligations exist to the NIC. So you have to get that from Inland Revenue, you then have to get that from the NIC. Isn't that right? Good. This occurs even though the NIC has judicial hypothecs against the properties of defaulting employers. These compliance certificates only have, Mr. Speaker, a life of 3 months. Once the 3 months are up, then you must go back all over again and apply. And you see the second time? It takes more time. You know what? I cannot understand it. You have issued a certificate of compliance. You give them the copy. You know, this is what you issued, you know. So you then have to wait more time for the second time. You would have thought it was easier, Mr. Speaker. So if the transaction is not completed within that time, the new letters, as I said, Mr. Speaker, must be sought. That takes ages. Mind you, Mr. Speaker, none of these requirements are statutory, but simply policy prescriptions. So it is, Mr. Speaker, compliance, compliance, compliance. That's what it is. And you know, I am reminded, Mr. Speaker, what's the time, Mr. Speaker? How much time I have? Let's take a time check. Huh?
26
Left? No, Mr. Speaker, you have that. I've told you before. You have that wrong. So, Mr. Speaker, it's compliance, compliance, compliance. What have we done? We have stifled creativity, imagination, and accountability. All we do is to frustrate citizens engaged in their legitimate business. That's what we are doing in this country. Truth be told, Mr. Speaker, and anybody, they can take me to task if they want. You know, these things are immune to me in these days. The NIC has become a monolith, feeding itself, consumed with its power, authority, and reach. NIC needs to take a close and hard look at itself and how it is treating citizens of this country. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, during the COVID pandemic, during the reign of the former government, I couldn't get any official from NIC on the phone to discuss a problem with them. Nobody would pick up the phone and answer. And everybody, the explanation is COVID, 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 COVID. I want to urge the government to collect the names of all managers of statutory bodies and circulate the names and numbers to all parliamentarians. No parliamentarian, whether opposition or government, should have to go through the difficulty. They cannot reach the director of the National Insurance Corporation or someone at the National Insurance Corporation of some significance who can deal with the problem of the Member of Parliament. They don't like me to say these things. They got annoyed because I say these things. Kenny Anthony this, Kenny Anthony, that's okay. I reach a point, these things don't matter to me. But I see evidence of it and the dangers and the fact that our citizens have to pay the price for it. Mr. Speaker, I will later in my presentation return to this issue because it is important. Now, Mr. Speaker, I did tell you I will look at some specific proposals. I will now turn to two specific proposals in the budget statement. The Minister of Finance has announced, Mr. Speaker, that the halls of justice will be constructed at the site of the old police headquarters on Lower Bridge Street. That disclosure was made on page 19 of his statement. He also disclosed that, quote, plans are afoot for the construction of a new police headquarters, page 51. Mr. Speaker, I interpret this to mean that the government has accepted the advice given to the former government, which advice, of course, was promptly dismissed by them. And I remember when I offered the advice in this house, and the member for Castries South shook his head wildly, wildly and in disagreement, that halls of justice cannot be accommodated in the same buildings as a police station headquarters. In fact, he went, I think, he Googled it, and he told me that there are lots of police stations in the UK with courts, etc., or something to that effect. The fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is that the business of the police is law and order and the protection of citizens of the state. That's its business. The police is part of the prosecuting arm of the state. We still have police cases. It is not part of the judiciary. Placing the judiciary in the same building with the police will only reinforce the perception that one of the prosecuting arms of the state is in bed with the judiciary. We have already made the mistake elsewhere in other police stations, and I plead I am guilty too because I should have known better, and we must not compound it now that we have a new opportunity to put it right. So I'm hoping, therefore, that the statement made by the Minister of Finance is clear that the site is only for, and I see he's nodding his head, is only for the construction of the halls of justice, only for that. But I hasten to add, because, Mr. Speaker, I'm very, very careful what I say in opposition, and I'm also very careful to have my own past actions. And I know for a fact that there's so many who throw at you, but you are there. You did this, you did that, or you should have done this. I know that. You'll get a lot of that too. You know, your time is coming. It's already here. But, well, that's for the former Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. I mean, I'm sure he's reflecting on all these things. I see Mr. King is not here. The member, sorry for Castries in office, Speaker. Now, while this is not my favored site, I still believe it's the best site for police headquarters, not for court. Not my favorite site. The decision to construct a dedicated halls of justice is certainly a welcome decision, and I applaud the decision. I merely hope, Mr. Speaker, that we shall see a new design befitting the description a halls of justice. I'll be very frank, I did not like the previous profile, architectural profile of the building that was planned, and that truly a proper halls of justice will be given life. I turn, Mr. Speaker, to my second unexpected project, that is, Mr. Speaker, St. Jude Hospital. I want to clear a few things in this house. And I want to clear a few things for those who are listening. I repeat, St. Jude Hospital is not in the constituency of Beaufort North. St. Jude Hospital is not in the constituency of Auger Labrie. St. Jude Hospital is in the constituency of Beaufort South. And I want to make it clear that I have primary responsibility for St. Jude and what happens to St. Jude because it is in my constituency. I want that to be understood. Mr. Speaker, having said this, any proposal to end the misery of the people of my constituency for access to health care deserves careful consideration. I will wait very carefully. I said a lot about St. Jude in the last campaign. And one of the things I did say, Mr. Speaker, was that, look, the health care of the people of St. Lucia is so critically important, we cannot and must not make the mistake of playing politics with the rebuilding of St. Jude. Mr. Speaker, the people of Beaufort South are tired. They're really tired. They have suffered enough. They want a quick resolution to the issue of St. Jude. The government has decided to pursue completion of the former St. Jude Hospital. It would be useful if the people of St. Lucia are told the likely cost to do so, if only to understand the prohibitive cost of completion of the so-called replacement building, the monstrosity constructed by Guy Joseph, the former member for Castries Southeast. I believe that that building will be an everlasting monument to the honorable member. The Minister of Finance has disclosed that to complete only the first floor of the monstrosity would cost $188 million. Presumably, therefore, completion may well attract a further $60 million or even more. In other words, to complete the monstrosity may well require another possibly $150 to $200 million. And we need authoritative clarification so that people could understand the choice that has been made. This is indeed shocking. I remember I repeatedly asked the former government to indicate the likely costs of the monstrosity, but was refused to do so. They refused to do so. In this house, I did so in nearly every budget presentation. And my friend, the member for Swazelle, you remember that, don't you? He does. He admits it. I said so. So I don't need additional proof. The integrity of the member for Swazelle speaks. I also warned repeatedly in this house, Mr. Speaker, that the building can never be completed in the time frame that was proposed. It will never be completed before the general election. And you know what? Every time I said so, I met jeers. Derision. But you know what I remember the most? While they scoffed and they laughed at me, the member for Castries North would bow his head gently to say, yes, you're right, you're right. You remember that? Yes, you're right. But the Minister of Finance has only told part of the story. Part of the story of the St. Jude saga. The rest, I suspect, is yet to come. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, the government paid Garth Patterson's firm out of Barbados, Lex Caribbean, the sum of $312,871 to review former contracts issued to the Halcro Group Limited, a company engaged by the former Prime Minister at the time, not me, but the honorable member for Castries North, to determine if a cause of action existed against its director. I have asked for the opinion, and I'm told that an opinion cannot be found. I suppose I'm entitled to it. If I don't get it, I'll have to subpoena the opinion. I want to see it, because a lot of names were tarnished in that process. People who didn't deserve it. And you know what my most memorable moments, Mr. Speaker? I've known a member for Swazelle, and I'm sorry I'm hitting on him, because he's, I know, but you're a point of reference.
Member for Beaufort South, you have 15 minutes left.
No, Mr. Speaker, you're not right. I've just started. Yes. that may have to happen on this occasion, I think. And I wanted to move the approval. Now, the member for Castries, for Swazelle, Mr. Speaker, I will never forget.
Member for Castries North.
Oh, have we reached that point? I was hoping just 5 minutes before, Mr. Speaker, we could do it.
Castries North had put on his light, sir.
Oh, he did. Well, in that event, that I sit.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that under 38.4 that the honourable member for the honourable member for VF4 South be given an extra 30 minutes.
No.
30.
Members, the question is that Standing Order 3210 be invoked to suspend 32.8 to allow the member for Viewfort South an additional 30 minutes in which to conclude his presentation. I now put the question. As many as of their opinion say aye. Aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Proceed, member.
Mr. Speaker, I thank members of the House for their generosity. But I was on this point here, Mr. Speaker. I was, just before the extension of time, Mr. Speaker, I made a point that some $312,871 was paid to Garth Patterson's firm out of Barbados, Lex Caribbean, to determine if a cause of action existed against the tiger. And I was about to just to illustrate what a colossal waste, but I was teasing the member for Swazelle, Mr. Speaker, saying that one of my most memorable moments of him was the occasion when the former government opened up St. Jude's to visitors to see what was then alleged how St. Lucian's was shortchanged and misled by the renovation works at the hospital and so on. That was all part of the marketing pitch to justify the closure and failure to complete the hospital. And I remember. And the member for Swazelle, the cameras caught him as he walked out. And you see, I like to make the reference because of our past association, past history. And he comes from Swazelle and a community of common stock. You know, when all is said and done, I'm really a Swazellian. And I know he knows all of that. And so we know each other well. And, you know, when he walked out on the cameras, folks to him and asked him, what did you think? He looked into the cameras and he replied, somebody has to pay for this. This cannot be accepted. Somebody has to pay for it. Now, I know you're not going to get up on a point of order. Because, you know, if you try that, you can watch a camera if you want. But that's what happened. And I said, my goodness. And look at how history has transpired, Mr. Speaker. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I want to come back. Mr. Speaker, never in our history have we paid so much in legal fees. And I really hope that this issue of legal fees, yes, correct. You might want to go and mention Grindberg, but I will save you. But Astafan, who has been maligned over fees, well, since you threw out a challenge, Mr. Attorney General, I want you to get all the figures that have been paid for Astafan and all the figures paid to Lex Caribbean, and I want you to bring it into this House as a document so the people of this country could see. Mrs. Astafan has been maligned. I have been maligned. And I want to find out what it is about Garth Patterson that he has to earn so much money for innocuous little acts of representation. I want to find out. Who? To who? He caused that? My goodness. You know, talking about lawyers, Mr. Speaker, talking about lawyers and fees and so on. I have to tell you a story at the right time, Mr. Speaker, of this famous...
Members, can we have one debate, please?
Yeah. Yes, this famous inquiry years ago, but I'll leave that for another time. Mr. Speaker, one thing is clear. The monstrosity cannot be allowed to stand for the future. I would advise you let me answer Lindquist in time. I'm tired of my constituency. Mr. Speaker, I'm tired of my constituency being burdened with ugly buildings by the government of St. Lucia and its agencies. I have to contend with a Wasco building. Now I have to contend with this unfinished hospital. Mr. Speaker, there are options. Perhaps the government can invite tenders for the building, market the building to a private investor, allow the investor to complete the building and work out lease payments over time based on the agreed expenditure on the building. In other words, forgive the lease payments for the expenditure incurred in completing the building and bringing the building to life. And maybe a dedicated hospital to specific medical problems is the solution. Mr. Speaker, I urge, if consideration is given to this, that this is not delayed. Whether we like it or not, the monstrosity was an ill-advised investment, and we cannot allow the taxpayers' money to disappear into nothing. The building cannot stay on the landscape incomplete and deteriorating with each passing day. Mr. Speaker, before I come to the section I call the little things that matter, I want to just indicate to you that I welcome the announcement of changes at the Labour Department, in particular the staffing arrangements announced by the Minister. Changes in staffing are badly needed, cannot wait a moment longer. However, there is no question that the Labour Code, necessary and vital as it has been, require urgent reform. I urge the Minister to read the several decisions of the Labour Tribunal as well as the courts to get a good sense of some of the issues which have arisen. There are now many low-hanging fruits to be picked, and quickly. I urge the Minister to appoint a tripartite review team almost immediately to examine the Labour Code and make recommendations for amendments to the legislation at the soonest. A year will soon be here. As the Minister for Finance was fond of saying during his 10 years opposition leader, 5 years is not 40 years. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to what I have described as the little things that matter. I do so not to detract from the proposals contained in the budget, but really to say that if we attend to these issues, then the benefits we will reap will be immense and create that kind of environment in the society that wins the support and confidence of citizens and taxpayers. I highlight these little things, Mr. Speaker, because they cause irritations to our daily lives, cause dysfunctionality, inefficiency, and sometimes encourage corruption. Historically, Mr. Speaker, we ignore these little things, allowing irritation, annoyance, and frustration to fester. First, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about the plight of small business renting or leasing public property. Mr. Speaker, there can be no question that the impact of COVID was devastating. We lost many lives. Our daily lives and routines were severely disrupted. The state and its citizens were in constant conflict. We were at war. Many businesses, especially small business, were lost, never to return. COVID will haunt our lives for a long time to come. Our thanks and appreciation must be declared to these institutions that extended a helping hand during the pandemic. I give thanks and praise to our indigenous banks and institutions, our credit unions, Lucia and even Wasco. But I will come back to Lucia in a few minutes, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, it will take months before we return to some normalcy. This has to be understood. It doesn't mean that because COVID appears to be on its way out, that suddenly all the small businesses are in a position to realize the sales and the benefits which had incurred from previous business. Institutions cannot proceed to behave as if all has returned to pre-COVID times. Because of the damage and trauma that was inflicted, the process of recovery will have of necessity be gradual. Banks are already closing in. Many have nowhere to turn. For that reason, it would be necessary to extend a helping hand to those who have survived. However, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the state cannot afford to be seen to engage in double standards. We ask our social partners to join in extending concessions to those in trouble. We preach to the private sector to ease up on rental payments. For example, some did, some did not. They ignored us. And the pleas did not just come from me, but also came from the then government. However, I cannot say that some of our state institutions were themselves the best examples of the calls for generosity, understanding, and patience. I believe that in the case of some of our state entities, it is necessary to provide ministerial direction and guidance at this time. It makes no sense for Blue Coral or for SLASPA, for example, to seek to terrorize or compel lease payments from their tenants when the businesses which they manage have almost collapsed. Recovery of businesses already heavily undercapitalized will be slow and gradual. This is the case especially for those small businesses that depended on tourism. Of course, there are tenants who will take advantage of public institutions in good times as well as in bad times. But all clients do not deserve to be painted with the same brush. In a presentation to this House a year ago, I drew attention of the House to the dramatic changes that had occurred in the banking sector, the significance of the departure of the Royal Bank of Canada and the Bank of St. Lucia from our domestic economy. And Mr. Speaker, Bank of Nova Scotia. Sorry, no, I said Bank of St. Lucia? We meant the Bank of Nova Scotia. Yes, thank you. I realize you're listening attentively. And Mr. Speaker, I hope that St. Lucians will never ever forget how they were treated by these departing banks in their closing days. Never ever ever forget the treatment that was meted out to ordinary people, Mr. Speaker. And not just ordinary people, but distinguished sons and daughters of this country too. We know too that First Caribbean also wanted to make an exit. In fact, an attempt to sell the bank's assets to a Colombian investor failed because of regulatory issues. Well, it's more than that. However, in the past few years, consumers have experienced an unprecedented increase in bank charges. Apart from the occasional complaints by irritated consumers, no one seemed to summon the courage to hold the banks to account. If a client keeps his or her balance below a required amount, charges are levied. So it's an amazing thing, you know. It's an amazing thing. You know, Mr. Speaker, if you keep the balance below the prescribed, every time they put I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, it happened to me, you know. I had an account from my firm for which I couldn't get a checkbook from the same bank. So I couldn't get a checkbook to issue checks. And you know, Mr. Speaker, every month they put a charge on the balance until I had to pay $1,000-something in fees. Imagine that, Mr. Speaker. They'll tell you that was negligent, but I was so fascinated by it. If a payment on a loan is late, a charge is levied. That's quite apart from interest, you know, Mr. Speaker. These are serious matters, Mr. Speaker. If, of course, the bank issues a letter to confirm a balance, a charge is levied. If, of course, you issue checks, a service charge is levied. All of those things, that one may be traditional. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that consumers cannot rely on the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank to protect them. Very clear. The central bank is not known to treat the protection of consumers as a priority. It's not concerned about that. What it is concerned about is the stability of the currency. It has no time for the users of banking services. It only wants to make sure that the banks keep to the guidelines set under the Act. It is consumed by and with other things. The complaints are not unique to St. Lucia. It has been heard across the region. Only recently, as I indicated last year, the Prime Minister of Barbados indicated that the banking services in that country will be reviewed in a bid to protect Barbadian consumers. It is time to stop pretending that real problems do not exist in the banking sector. The time has come for domestic banking legislation to protect consumers. The tool of moral suasion can no longer work with banks. It can't. How many times we in this chamber and we plead and beg and say, do this, do that. They never do it. They want to come and bargain with you and tell you, go and revise the laws. Go and revise the laws regarding defaulting mortgages. Then they want to do it. As offering a quid pro quo. But meanwhile, consumers suffer. Am I right? Insolvency will not deal with the problem. Contrary, not with the banks. You need to protect people from the banks. Mr. Speaker, another area of rising concern for our citizens is the treatment meted out to consumers by our public utility companies. Again, I do not wish to be misunderstood. I repeat myself. Both Lucia and Wasco deserve commendation for assisting consumers to handle the aftershocks of COVID. To their credit, they have both been responsive to requests for adjustments in payment schedules for unpaid bills. To their credit. And I must say, I have had to deal with them, and I welcome the approach that is utilized. While I complain about the exceedingly high cost one pays for electricity in this country, I do admire Lucia for its ruthless efficiency. Lucia is ruthlessly efficient, and you have to admire them for it. But they get the job done. I cannot say the same thing about our mobile providers and the services made available to consumers. Mr. Speaker, I certainly do not believe we should return to the days when a Public Utilities Commission would set the rates and charges because there's a regulatory authority. However, I want to urge that the minister who is responsible consider the establishment of a mechanism akin to a public utilities watchdog to allow consumers to air their grievances and issues with service providers. What do you do when they present to you bills you can't understand? You're trying to decipher. You try and have an explanation with them. And they tell you, call their contact number. And when you call their contact number, an automated service comes in and is one rigmarole, Mr. Speaker. Go to this number or that number for this. When you go to that number and you push it in, they tell you, well, if this is this, you have to go to this. I've never seen such a thing like this. How can we allow this kind of thing to exist? Mr. Speaker, I want to turn to my fourth little matter that needs to be looked at. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn briefly to the Land Registration Department, which I looked at earlier and considered earlier. Mr. Speaker, I plead guilty that during my tenure as Minister of Finance, I paid too little attention to the land registry. That was unfortunate. And I openly admit, now that I'm back in private practice, the issues that should have been tackled years ago were not tackled, and they come out with great clarity. We must bear in mind that the land registry is a major income earner for the government of St. Lucia. And when you look at the revenue estimates, you will see the amounts that are paid for vendors, tax, etc. is a very significant amount. Even more income can be generated if we dispense with some of the foolish practices which exist. For example, the refusal to stamp more than one notarized copy of an original document. I'll give you a classic case. You prepare a notarized deed of sale or a hypothec or mortgage. Okay. You present you do two copies. Not you, because there can be only one original copy in law. One, which a lawyer has to keep. But you do two copies. And you do it and you ask them you sign it as the notary, you sign it and ask them to stamp it. If you see you make the mistake and you send more than 1 or 2, they return it to you, and tell you you can only have one. Why would you do such a thing? When in fact what you need to do is to charge more for the third copy. Charge $80 or $100. Because sometimes if you're dealing with a hypothec, Mr. Speaker, you want to send a notarized copy to the bank that has issued the mortgage. You want to send copies to the mortgagee as well as the mortgagor, and to both. What's the problem? And when you do send it, they tell you you're causing trouble. Why are you doing this? Why you don't? The state's business should be maximizing returns. But I have, in their defense, got to say, well, especially the land registry, that this is a department which is both understaffed and under-resourced, and we need to understand its economic value. And this is a problem we have with the Ministry of Finance, you know. They don't understand the economic value of services to the country. All they do is that they assess how much money you make, and they determine if you merit attention depending on the amount of money you make. But sometimes they don't know what makes money and what does not make money. It's a culture, it's a disease. They're being pure economists. They don't face reality. Mr. Speaker, try as that department might, the department is under huge pressure to register on a timely basis the documents presented to it for filing in accordance with the Land Registration Act. These delays impede commerce and registrable economic transactions. And I don't have to tell you the damage it does to foreign investors as well. COVID did compel some changes, and the department must be complimented for allowing requests for land register records to be made online. This has made a huge difference. And I want to urge the Inland Revenue Department to take a page out of the leaf of the land. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's so easy now. You stay in your office, you just send them an email, I need these land register records for block and parcel list, and a couple hours, a day or two, you get it back. You don't have to send your assistant to the land registry office to get it. It has made a huge difference in the lives of lawyers. But we must get rid of some of the compliance requirements. NIC must not be allowed to get away with this nonsense. It is changes like this which NIC and the Inland Revenue need to introduce to end the frustration which they encourage unwittingly or otherwise. Again, the issues which face the registration of documents in the land registry is a low-hanging fruit. Perhaps a small team led by an eminent lawyer who has a passion for reform can be appointed to review the staffing and procedures of the department. No, I'm not in that. Don't ask me to. I have no interest in it. I'm just making the point. They deserve encouragement. Mr. Speaker, I know you will summon the bell in a few minutes, but I can't let this budget occasion pass without making reference to a very important matter for my constituency. Mr. Speaker, today the Immigration Department is closed, and I don't think there's a reopening date just yet, next Tuesday. But that doesn't undermine the point I'm about to make. The question is, why must this be allowed to happen in 2022 when in 2016 financing was secured and sod was turned for the construction of an administrative complex in Jude Hospital? I will never forgive the opposition when it was government for what it did when it dismantled and prevented that administrative center. It was so misguided. And they put a Wasco building, no character, no honor, no definition. You know, the architecture of the Wasco building was intended to make a political statement about you, you know, and about me too, you know. I don't know. The leader of the opposition has all the time in the world to respond. And if he rises after me to respond, then he can tell me what his thinking was that he approved the design. But I believe you followed the advice of the then chairman of Wasco, an old school friend of mine who I know very, very well, Francis Denbo. I know him very, 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 very well. I was so startled when he was appointed chairman of Wasco. You did that? It was, My point, Mr. Speaker, is this. Had the administrative building in Beaufort been constructed, it would have been available to house an immigration department so people from the south could obtain passports in the south. It was stopped and we are paying the price. You know, and I promise you I'll be quick with this. History has a strange way of speaking to us, Mr. Speaker. And in my experience, every initiative that has been undertaken that has been stopped, we come to reap the pain that was inflicted. We stopped the laptop program. COVID hit. And then we had to run all over the place to get all kinds of, whether it's, what do you call it, e-books or laptops or stuff. You understand what I'm saying? You understand what I'm saying? We stopped the administrative complex. We added to our woes. And the list can go on and on. And what fascinates me, Mr. Speaker, is that there comes a time when what once seemed to be unacceptable suddenly emerges with a clarity that justifies their very existence. Circumstances have changed, I guess. So, Mr. Speaker, we have missed an opportunity because had the administrative complex been in existence, who knows, they could have issued passports from down south while the office in Castries was in fact closed for whatever reason. Mr. Speaker, I am sorry I missed the presentation of the Honorable Member for Castries Southeast as he discussed his ministry, although I did pick up some of it. But I want to, and I do not recall he made any authoritative clarification regarding the future of the STEP program. I believe that honorable members now understand, and especially honorable members now in opposition, that this STEP program was more than just a beautification program. As the people of Beaufort South would say it, STEP gave them an opportunity to demonstrate their pride in their community. I remember driving around and remarking which constituency did an excellent job and where we need to work with the STEP workers to improve the quality of their work. And I've always used to tell cabinet colleagues that the best work that I saw was in Micoud North. I mean, it was amazing when you reach the outer boundaries of Micoud North, driving south, how Tobago didn't feature that. How well the workers had, handled their caretaker responsibility. Whether we like it or not, Mr. Speaker, STEP was also a form of empowerment. Not everyone, as I've said, can build drains and roads, yet not everyone has the skills and education background to do otherwise. And I keep on saying, and I'm not blaming the historical record for the fact that we have emancipated in our communities hundreds and thousands of people who have absolutely no skills. We have to look after them. Someone has to look after them. Someone has to reach out to them. We need to ensure that people can feel that they can be part of their country, part of their community, part of the economy. And they can be in the mainstream of the economy, whether it is buying or selling. But we have to. And I really hope that perhaps in the response of the Minister of Finance, we can get what I would describe only as authoritative clarification. Mr. Speaker, all of this is to say to you that the people of Beaufort South misstep and have expressed their desire that we give them a break so that they can pay their bills. My final comments, Mr. Speaker, deals with the issue of youth empowerment. And I will be short too, Mr. Speaker, because I know very soon the bell will ring. How many? Oh, Mr. Speaker, then I'll go to town. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have had to do a lot of reflection these past few months over the issue of crime and citizen security in our country. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that it is useful if we recount the historical record for the benefit of all members, because I really do believe that crime and security is something that should be elevated in cooperation between the government and the opposition. And A while ago, the Minister of Health spoke of the need to create a parliamentary committee to look at health issues, which I think is necessary. In fact, those of us who are pleading for constitutional reform should really be focusing on this House and totally reforming the House processes, because we are not bound by the constitutional requirements, save that the protections that are in the Constitution for members of the House, meaning principally their freedom of speech, etc. And we need to rethink those things. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not digressing, I would love to see the day when we can have an institution comparable to the UK Parliament, the Prime Minister's question time, where questions can be posed to the Prime Minister over the governance of the country and issues confronting the country. So I think these are low-hanging fruits. And if you can do a radical adjustment of the standing orders, then a lot can be achieved. And certainly I believe that we need a parliamentary subcommittee on citizen and security. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I want to say up front, I compliment the government for making the vehicles available to the police. They need it. I see them driving around their new shiny vehicles. They need it. I applaud that. I welcome that. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? We have been down that road before. I remember after Cricket World Cup, over 30, 40, 50 vehicles, you might remember, were made available to the police. But what did we see? What did we see but a continued rise in crime? It means, Mr. Speaker, that the issues are deep. The issues are complex. The issues are pernicious. And I want to say to the House that we have to do a complete rethinking of our approach to crime. We are pursuing models that are not viable. And we have done it for years. Mr. Speaker, just bear in mind, over the years, we were told that we need to reform the criminal laws. What did we do? We enacted a new criminal code. Very recent criminal code, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we were told that the laws of evidence were antiquated. We need new laws of evidence. We enacted a new law of evidence for criminal matters. Mr. Speaker, we were told repeatedly that we don't have the capacity to do DNA, that we need to set up a facility for DNA for tests and other related tests apart from DNA. We spent millions, and I'm going to forget the politics where the leader of the opposition made certain statements in a previous life, because he's been converted, and everyone can be converted on a route oh yes, he was converted on that single matter. But he was converted on the road to Damascus and saw the value of the forensic lab. We did it. We introduced a forensic lab. We were told that we had insufficient police officers, and we set about increasing the establishment of police officers. We increased the numbers. I recall, Mr. Speaker, and I'm certain that the member for Castries North in his former capacity will recall, there were about 790 police officers in the early years. That was increased to over 1,000 plus. Still, the problems persisted. We were told that we needed to reform the system of judicial decision-making on the criminal front. What did we do? And that was not an initiative of the judiciary, Mr. Speaker. You should know. You would know, I'm sure. We created a criminal division of the High Court. This was done by the Labour government, and I'm going to be bold to say, by myself at the time. So that we had a separate jurisdiction to handle criminal matters. Mr. Speaker, go to Borderley. Hundreds are on remand. It has taken us years to make decisions in criminal matters. The system is clogged. We were told that we had a problem with the prosecuting arm of the state. We transformed the prosecuting arm into a Crown Prosecution Service, did make some additional appointments, and for the moment, I will ignore the skirmishes over the appointment of a DPP, as if the Prime Minister had authority to appoint DPP. Never had. It's always the Judicial Legal Services Commission. All you do all that happened was that the Chief Justice asked the Prime Minister whether he agreed or disagreed with the appointment. That's all. But he is not the appointing authority. So what did we do? Adjustments again was made on the prosecuting side, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we were told that there were too many firearms in the country, and we approached it by doing something that was not unusual to St. Lucia. We gave rewards to bring the firearms in. The former government, this time under Prime Minister King, abolished it. They had a problem with it, notwithstanding that we had significant intakes of firearms and in the country. I will never forget that we were told that we have a problem with intelligence gathering and that the police needed help, especially for those who made disclosures of criminal offenses and criminal behavior by individuals. We reacted by giving the police a huge increase in the vote to reward persons who provided information and intelligence to the police. I don't know where that is. We were told we needed cameras. The former government again made a huge investment. We continue that. This government intends to make another investment. I don't know what impact those cameras have had, but I emphasize it only to make the point, Mr. Speaker, of another investment to fight crime. Mr. Speaker. And I mean, what I'm saying, the experience is littered with efforts by this country to deal with crime. But it appears that crime is beating us, beating our intellectual and policy capacities to deal with it. What I do know is that we are approaching the issue of criminal behavior in traditional ways, and it will no longer work. Every day it's a struggle, a fight to put police on the streets. There are things that happen in GFR South I cannot explain. I cannot explain, Mr. Speaker. I'm tired of issuing statements when a criminal act is committed in GFR South, deprecating what has occurred. Only recently, Mr. Speaker, I had to visit a family, a mother, an elderly mother, who unfortunately received a shot to her chest while in her kitchen, in a home, an upstairs building, to console her and to apologize. That's the reality of existence. But you know what? We are spinning top in mud because we are doing the same things over and over. So we provide them with new vehicles, provide them with new weapons. But the fundamental changes that are required, we are not doing. You know, Mr. Speaker, I am now a practicing lawyer. I have the opportunity to advise those who are in practice. Mr. Speaker, I have the opportunity to dialogue with those engaged in the criminal law. And one of the things that has shocked me is this. You know, we have trained the Royal St. Lucia Police Force in handling not just crime scenes, but in the interrogation of persons who, quote unquote, they have reasonable cause to believe to have caused a crime or about to commit a crime. But you know what? The procedures have gone haywire. The young officers do not know how the procedures should apply and how the procedures should work. What are the rights of lawyers who are representing clients? What are the rights of clients? We have gone back in time, back to the old ways and to the old habits. So, Mr. Speaker, it's pointless you tell me that the solution is to create another crime commission. It's pointless to tell me that, you know, the solution is to make more vehicles. And you know, I even forgot the big one, Mr. Speaker. They used to tell us that, look, the police will never function to their maximum level if they don't have good buildings in which to work. I accept that you need decent buildings in which to work. I accept that. And that has nothing to do with the point about that and the dealing with crime, in my view, because they're entitled as workers to have decent conditions, and I applaud that. What did I do? What did the former government do? Build police stations, repair police stations left, right, and center, all over the place. The one that was outstanding is the Grosley, and everybody knows that we were in discussions with NIPRO years ago. That should have been built immediately after we lost the government in 2016 because all the arrangements were made. All the arrangements were made with NIPRO. I remember the member for Grosley. I'm in my skin. Every time she have a meeting, Grosley Police Station, Grosley Police Station, Grosley Police Station. Or the more I tell I build your fire station, what are you making noise about? Grosley Police Station, Grosley Police Station. So, Mr. Speaker, we repaired some buildings. And
Remember, you have 5 minutes left.
You don't like my stories, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, what I'm trying to say to you is germane, is fundamental to this, to the points. You work with me. All right, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we have done all these things. The question is, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? We cannot look to the rest of the Caribbean. They don't know how to deal with the problem. I mean, you just watch the Trinidad and watch Jamaica. Jamaica, of course, the big difference is that they have their army available to them to deploy when they announce state of emergencies in particular parts of the country. But I will say this before I demit that topic this week. While I welcome the emphasis on youth empowerment through a youth economy, I believe that the time has come where the government must fashion a special program of economic amelioration in the key communities where crime is rampant to wean those individuals away from criminal activity. The gang leaders are under immense pressure because a lot of them have in fact fostered several young persons who are dependent on them for an income and cannot handle those incomes. In my experience in J4 South, Mr. Speaker, when I reach out to members of those community organizations, because they don't like to be called gangs, and provide opportunities to them, you see almost a corresponding reduction in criminal behavior. And don't make a mistake about it. I have a lot of people who leave in the rest of the country, leaving Castries and coming down to Vieux-Fort and commit crime. They bring down to Vieux-Fort their most sophisticated criminal ways and habits and engage in criminal activity in my constituency. And I will name the constituencies if I'm provoked. But I'll stay away from it just for the moment, Mr. Speaker. Watch my eyes. Watch it, and you know what I'm talking about. So, Mr. Speaker, we need a targeted program to support whatever measures that can be fashioned to deal with those inner city communities, to wean them and bring them into the economy so that they too are part of this economy. And we must not be afraid of being labeled as rewarding criminals. We have to save our communities. We have to save them. Mr. Speaker, it cannot be right that young boys who were raised in Bruceville, who went to school with boys in the Mang, who shared benches in school with boys in the Bacadere and Vieux-Fort, cannot cross the New Dock Road to go in the Mang, cannot cross Clark Street to go into the Bacadere. It cannot be right that a young man in Bruceville who has fathered a child from a mother in the Mang, who has a girlfriend in the Mang, cannot go to the Mang in a small community like Vieux-Fort because of boundaries created by gang activity. It cannot be right, Mr. Speaker. The community is too small. And you're going to tell me that the best way to deal with this is from time to time send a corps of police fellas to raid the Mang or to go and raid Bruceville? That's the solution? That can never be the solution. Although citizens demand quick solutions, and maybe this year should be devoted to that, but we need a comprehensive program, targeted and focused on empowering these individuals in this very... You have any in Grosley? You watching me? You have in Grosley? I know you're all rich, full of money up there, you know. You don't need these things. And by the way, you see the largest you get in? You see the largest you get from the government? Give me down some of your Vieux-Fort South. because, you have a sense of equity, don't you? Right, Mr. Speaker? So I just wanted to remind him. But the fact of the matter is the approaches have to be different. Mr. Speaker, we need a new and different kind of dialogue. And while I'm on this topic, I want to urge the government, urge the Attorney General, and this is one time I don't think he'll be upset with me. He needs to enact a new police act almost immediately. You cannot continue with the old colonial instrument that is causing havoc. The key to starting the process of modernization is to enact a new police act to redefine powers, responsibilities within the police force, and to set up community accountability for the police in the various communities. We have to do it, and we must do it quickly. Mr. Speaker, time is drawing, and I know you want me to finish. I will therefore be quick. When I examine the figures presented to us, Mr. Speaker, it becomes clear that the recovery is on the way. Mr. Speaker, it is equally clear that the recovery is fragile and there are storm clouds ahead. Already we have seen the impact of supply shortages and the impact of war in Ukraine on prices of goods and services. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, that as we go along, that we will spend a lot of time to share with the public the issues with prices and the problems that are arising, and I believe there's a lot of work to be done by the Minister of Commerce. We cannot ignore the problem. What all of this says is that we will have to manage adroitly, pragmatically, and realistically. And I have no doubt that this Prime Minister and this Minister of Finance has the skills to do so. Recoveries can be fragile and therefore easily derailed. For those reasons, Mr. Speaker, this recovery must be carefully watered and nourished if its benefits are to be realized and enjoyed. I thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
A member for Castries North.
Mr. Speaker, permit me this opportunity this afternoon to commence my presentation by acknowledging the people who have sent me to this honorable house term after term after term. Notwithstanding the efforts of those who failed the people and the attempt to hang on to the coattails of what they believe was legacy and pedigree, the people of Castries North said, "Not in Blue Wave City." And so, Mr. Speaker, they resoundingly returned me on this occasion to continue my task and my job of serving them with dignity, with integrity, and a sense of purpose and reason and cause for the plight of the people. But, Mr. Speaker, there is a famous verse, 1 Corinthians 13:11 in the Bible, which states, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up all childish ways." However, Mr. Speaker, in reality, that is not always the case. For there are some confused men, maybe childish, aliens to the truth, who will say, "Ever since I became a boss, I continued to speak like a child, to think like a child, to reason like a child, to believe like a child. When I become a child, I will give up all my mannish ways." Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the two most recent sittings of this Honorable House have brought to the fore some unimaginable, unbelievable, despotic, yet childish attitudes by some who have not awakened ever since they fell asleep to that bedtime story on the night of July 26, 2021. They are still sleeping. They wake up occasionally and they continue to behave like they are children. They have failed to realize that the authority once held no longer exists, except in their imagination, in Akai Bolo, in Tiroche, dubbed the People's Parliament. But the People's Parliament, Mr. Speaker, is here. And when we are called here to discuss the People's Parliament, if we are overseas, we must come down to serve the people in the Parliament and not play games, hide and seek like children, and then demanding who should stand, who should sit, who should talk, and whose game it is. In the Kaibolo, Mr. Speaker, the so-called People's Parliament, not even his sidekick in this Honorable House was present to give him support. Not one chairperson presented themselves in the Kaibolo. But of course, the event must be held at the time, because there was need to hastily convene it to facilitate his takeoff in first class to witness Tiger Woods at the Masters tournament, rather than to remain and to serve the people in the Parliament of this country. Mr. Speaker, I've highlighted all of this to say I have followed this Parliament for decades, as a child and as a man, in and out of government, and I have seen and experienced parliamentarians, prime ministers, and leaders of opposition behave spiritedly, boisterously, and that is spelled B-O-I-S, not B-O-I, and passionately in the advancement of the people's business. I lived, I saw these things, I participated, I admired. This country, Mr. Speaker, has experienced the dignity and humility of leaders who fell into opposition, like Sir George F.L. Charles, the champion of the working class, the erudite retired jurist, Sir Alan Louisy, the astute father of the nation, Sir John Compton, the hard-working and devoted Sir Julian Hunt, the learned Dr. Kenny Anthony, former leader and parliamentary representative for Vieux South, who just spoke. And there were others like Neville Snark, who crossed the floor, Verlon John, Reed George, who stood alone and championed the cause of the people of this country. Those were men who cared for their country. Those were men who cared for their people. There was Marius Wilson, unfortunately, Arson James, Marcus Nicholas, poor soul, Gail Rigobert, and the current Prime Minister, the Honorable Philip J. Pierre, who served with dignity and determination in this Parliament. You know, for the last 5 years, Mr. Speaker, that I served on the other side, all of the 5 budget presentations made by the then Prime Minister was responded to immediately by the then Leader of the Opposition, now the great Prime Minister of this country, Philip J. Pierre. He stood up, he was ridiculed, he was chastised, but he responded to the budget with great dexterity and information, and he served his people in that manner. Mr. Speaker, I too served as Leader of the Opposition, but never in the history of this Parliament has any of the leaders mentioned earlier ever quarreled, creating a public spectacle so profusely about his or her right to turn to speak or not to speak in this Parliament that is governed by rules. Notwithstanding, Mr. Speaker, our political differences of opinion, character, philosophy, and ideals, never before has there ever been so much baseless rhetoric about speaking order in a parliamentary system where each member has the right to speak, not to dictate. The right to speak, not to dictate, but in accordance with parliamentary rules, procedure, practice, and the standing orders of this Honorable House. As a servant of the people of St. Lucia, I am also proud to be part of this government which has a conscience, a soul, a purpose, and a cause. A government that cares for and about people, and a government of inclusiveness. I'm proud to be part of this government. Mr. Speaker, throughout my political career, to be exact, 41 years, serving at every conceivable level in the political party hierarchical structure, and in government, in almost every ministry, in almost every public building, even though I saw the SLP as an adversary, I never saw them as an enemy. We all work together. I remember giving in this Parliament, Mr. Speaker, my very early years as minister, young minister of youth and sports. I was younger than Kenson and younger than Jeremiah.
Member, be careful of calling members by name.
Oh, my apologies, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I remember giving this story of I being Minister for Youth and Sports and Sir Julian Hunt being Leader of the Opposition. And the way we worked, every member on the opposite side then, and Sir Julian would call my phone, in those days no cell phone, call my phone at 6 o'clock in the morning or 5:30 in the morning, whatever time, very early, and he'd say to my mother, "Ko Steve, you got on me." And my mother, I used to say to her, "You are Julian Hunt's secretary," because she always reminds me, "Don't forget Mr. Hunt, don't forget Mr. Hunt." Mr. Speaker, I'm saying this to say the kind of camaraderie, the respect, the behavior, the respect that is required in the Parliament. That's what existed. That's what existed. But, Mr. Speaker, I believe the time has come for a new kind of politics. Yes. inclusive politics. A politics that always puts the people and the country first, and not ourselves as politicians. You know, I always say, in fact, that the way I lived before I got into politics, I continued in politics. I consider the road of politics to be a two-way street. One day I'm going up, one day I'm going down. I'll meet those who I pass on my way up, and they will receive me on my way down. And so we have to be humble, and we have to understand that this place is not our home. Mr. Speaker, the politics of today of this inclusive government is a politics that allows us to put the people and the country first. A politics of conscience. A politics in which we can disagree, debate, and arrive at the best solutions for our collective progress as a united nation and a people. But, Mr. Speaker, most significantly, I stand here in my unwavering support for the Appropriation Bill 2022-23, the budget address entitled Empowering Our People, Transforming Our Economy, as delivered by the Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, the Honorable Philip J. Pierre. Mr. Speaker, what defines this budget is not just the brilliant initiatives expressed by the Prime Minister, not just the programs, social programs presented by the Prime Minister, not just the subsidies on cooking gas or increase in personal tax allowances, not all the niceties that were presented by the Honorable Prime Minister, not all of the relief measures, but rather the core statement in the introduction of the Prime Minister's statement, in which he said, I want to begin my address by telling this Parliament and the people of St. Lucia who we are and what we stand for as a government. He went on to say, this is very important, Mr. Speaker, so that the citizens of St. Lucia, at home and in the diaspora, understand what motivates and drives this government. Mr. Speaker, what motivates and drives this government has nothing to do with how we feel about each other, how we relate to each other, but all about our commitment to the cause of the people of this country. That is what it is about. The Prime Minister went on to say that at the core of our value system is the fundamental belief in social justice and wealth creation, a belief that every man, woman, and child should have an opportunity to reach their full human potential. And that statement, Mr. Speaker, is strong. It's meaningful. Because when we speak about opportunity for every man, every woman, and every child in this country to reach their full human potential, it speaks to the programs within the budget. Whether it's every family to have a university graduate, every school child to be able to receive support for government and their fees are paid, every child rather, can receive a laptop so he or she doesn't feel disadvantaged. Every family can know that there's a government who cares about them. And every family knows that a government who cares will provide them with food, clothing, and shelter. That is what this inclusive government is about. More so, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister went on to say, my government intends to govern by the principles of inclusiveness, accountability, equity, meritocracy, and the rule of law so that corruption, wastage, and inefficiency are minimized. And so, Mr. Speaker, this last statement that I just made there from the Prime Minister is indeed the bedrock upon the reason why I am here today. This is why I am here on this side, on mission and in support of the policies, the principles of this government to govern by the principles of inclusiveness, accountability, equity, meritocracy, and the rule of law, so that corruption, wastage, and inefficiency are minimized. You know, yesterday, Mr. Speaker, when my good friend from Choiseul spoke, and he attempted to heavy lifting. So he has taken on Rodney Bay Road Improvement Project. And I said to him, do not go there. And he should listen to me, you know. Because this is not, Mr. Speaker, this is not the first time I've been warning this gentleman. He's my friend. You know, I'll say something about, I'll give him a break. But Mr. Speaker, he came with the Rodney Bay Road Improvement Project. At some stage, Mr. Speaker, I'll be making a formal report in this Parliament on Rodney Bay Road Improvement Project, on the National Roads Rehabilitation Project, and a number of projects which were undertaken under the last administration, which I was once part of. I have given the story of how this road started, and I know, Mr. Speaker, you may not want to give me another hour, but I'll try to at least précis what I'm about to say. And I notice the member for Miko South has disappeared. But I was invited one day, quite accidentally, to take a tour with the then Prime Minister to Rodney Bay, because he wanted to plant flowers. He wanted to put palms in Rodney Bay. He wanted to beautify Rodney Bay and to make Rodney Bay look like a more presentable community. I couldn't, beg your pardon? Yeah. So, Mr. Speaker, having invited me, I realized I couldn't do it, and so I sent the gentleman most qualified to go and see what flowers he needed, what garden plants, etc., to beautify Rodney Bay. The next thing I knew, an artistic impression of a road, a four-lane highway with roundabouts for Rodney Bay came to my office, and I said, this cannot work. No investigations, no scientific analysis, nothing